Section 1. The show that was always in trouble. The Simpsons debuted on December 17th, 1989, and within about 4 weeks, it had already made someone angry enough to write a formal letter of complaint. That is not an exaggeration. That is essentially the foundational rhythm of this show's entire existence. It was born into controversy, and it has never once stepped out of it. Before we get into any of the specific scandals, it helps to understand what The Simpsons was walking into when it first arrived on American television. The landscape of primetime animation in 1989 was essentially a wasteland of soft, consequence-free cartoons aimed either at very young children or at nobody in particular. The Flintstones was considered the gold standard of animated adult comedy, and even that show had been off the air since 1966. Saturday morning was packed with educational programming dressed up in cheap animation. The idea of a primetime animated series with real satirical teeth, with characters who fought and lied and failed publicly and spectacularly, was genuinely foreign to the medium. And then Matt Groening drew a family on a napkin in a waiting room at Fox, and everything changed. But the thing about change is that it almost always upsets someone. The Simpsons did not arrive gently. It arrived like a brick through a window, loud and sudden and impossible to ignore. And the people who got upset in those early years were not fringe voices. They were presidents. They were first ladies. They were evangelical ministers with national radio audiences and senators with press offices and school boards with budgets. The Simpsons managed to unite critics from opposite ends of virtually every cultural fault line, which is actually a remarkable achievement if you think about it. It offended conservatives and occasionally drew heat from progressives. It angered religious groups across multiple denominations. It drove network censors to distraction, pushed sponsors to their limits, and somehow, in spite of all of it, it kept going. 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes, the longest-running primetime scripted series in the history of American television. The scandals did not stop the show. In many ways, the scandals were the show. The controversy was not a side effect of what The Simpsons was doing. It was evidence that The Simpsons was doing something real. So let us start at the beginning, because the beginning is where the tone gets set. Fox Broadcasting Company was itself a relatively new enterprise when The Simpsons landed on its schedule. The network had launched in 1986, just 3 years before Bart Simpson first told a classroom full of animated students that he was nobody's fool. Fox was hungry. It was scrappy. It was explicitly positioning itself as the network for viewers who had grown bored with the programming on ABC, NBC, and CBS. The Fox identity, to whatever extent it existed in those early years, was built around the idea of doing things the other networks would not do. The Simpsons fit that identity perfectly, and the friction between the show's creative team and the network's standards and practices department began almost immediately. The Fox censors in those early years were not prepared for what Groening and his team were bringing them. The notes were constant and, by most accounts from the writers involved, genuinely baffling. There were objections to specific lines of dialogue that were not dirty by any reasonable standard but simply sounded irreverent in a way that made the censors nervous. There were notes about Homer's treatment of Bart, about the way the show depicted authority figures, about the general attitude of the Simpson children toward their parents and their school and their community. The censors wanted deference that the show had no interest in providing. Al Jean, who has been one of the show's executive producers for most of its run, and who served as a writer and showrunner during its early peak seasons, has talked about these negotiations in various interviews over the years. The picture that emerges is one of a creative team that quickly learned how to manage the system, how to identify which battles were worth fighting, and which notes could be absorbed without fundamentally compromising the work. The writers became expert at arguing for lines that mattered while letting the network win on the things that did not. It was chess more than combat, and the show's early writers were unusually good at it. But some fights were unavoidable. The word hell was a recurring battleground. The show wanted to use it casually, the way people actually speak, the way the Simpson family would plausibly speak if they were real. The censors wanted to limit its use. There were negotiations about frequency, about context, about who could say it, and in what circumstances. This sounds absurd from a contemporary vantage point, but it reflected genuine anxiety within the network about what sponsors would tolerate and what affiliate stations in conservative markets would air. Fox's affiliate network in those years was not as robust as the established networks, and the relationship between Fox corporate and its affiliates was already complicated. A show that drove affiliates to preempt was a problem nobody wanted. The donuts and beer were a different kind of concern, not in terms of content specifically, but in terms of implication. Homer's relationship with alcohol was a recurring point of sensitivity. The show wanted to portray a character who drank beer the way millions of American men drank beer, without treating it as a crisis or a character flaw that needed to be addressed and resolved. The idea of casual, unremarkable adult drinking in a family cartoon was genuinely novel and genuinely uncomfortable for certain advertisers. The show navigated this by never making Homer's drinking the explicit subject of a joke in a way that could be read as glamorizing alcoholism, while also never pretending that Homer was not a man who drank beer on his couch every evening because he enjoyed it. The tension with the network over content was, in the early years, primarily about tone rather than about specific, objectionable material. The Simpsons was not trying to push graphic content. It was trying to push a general attitude of irreverence, a refusal to treat authority as inherently worthy of respect, a willingness to let the parents in a family cartoon be wrong, selfish, and occasionally kind of terrible. The show wanted permission to be honest about what families actually looked like, and the network was not entirely sure the audience was ready for that honesty. Then came the thing that made all of those internal negotiations look minor. In January 1992, President George H.W. Bush gave a speech at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in which he said, and this is a real thing that actually happened in American history, that he wanted American families to be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons. The President of the United States, at a formal address to a national religious organization, cited a cartoon family as an example of cultural decline. Think about what that moment represented. A sitting president, speaking to a room full of religious broadcasters with national reach, chose a fictional animated family as the emblem of everything he thought was going wrong with American culture. Not a violent film, not a controversial news story. A cartoon about a round-headed man who worked at a nuclear plant and occasionally strangled his son. That was the symbol he chose. And in choosing it, he gave The Simpsons a gift that no marketing campaign could have bought. The writers responded faster than any press office could have anticipated. Within days, they had written and produced a response. In the very next episode to air after Bush's comments, Bart Simpson looked directly at the camera and said something to the effect that the Simpsons were just like the Waltons because both families were praying for the end of the Depression. The joke landed. The clip circulated. And suddenly The Simpsons was not just a popular television show. It was a participant in American political discourse. The cartoon had punched the President of the United States, and the President had definitely felt it. This moment established something important about the show's cultural position. The Simpsons was not going to apologize for what it was. It was not going to soften itself in response to political pressure from any direction. It would engage with its critics, but it would engage on its own terms, through comedy, through wit, through the specific language of satire that the show had developed. And that response would almost always be funnier and sharper than whatever provoked it. The Bush incident was not the last time a sitting American president would have opinions about The Simpsons, but it was the most dramatic early example of the show's collision with official culture. It set a template that would repeat itself in various forms for the next 3 decades. There were school boards across the country in those early years that tried to restrict access to Simpsons merchandise on school property. The concern was that Bart Simpson's attitude, his particular flavor of cheerful disrespect for authority, was a corrupting influence on children. Schools issued bans on Bart t-shirts. Some went further, banning Simpsons lunchboxes and backpacks. A few districts held formal meetings to discuss whether allowing Simpsons merchandise constituted an endorsement of values incompatible with the educational environment they were trying to create. These bans had roughly the effect you would expect. Children who had not previously cared about Bart Simpson became deeply interested in him the moment he was forbidden. The merchandise sales, which were already extraordinary, climbed higher. The cultural cachet of The Simpsons, particularly among exactly the demographic the show was hoping to capture, grew in direct proportion to the official disapproval being directed at it. There is no better advertising than being banned. The merchandise empire itself was a source of some of the show's earliest internal conflicts, though those conflicts were conducted at a level removed from public view. The sheer volume of Simpsons-branded products that flooded the market in the early 1990s was historically unprecedented for a television property. The licensing arrangements had been structured in a way that made Fox very wealthy and the show's creators considerably less so, a disparity that would generate years of quiet resentment and eventually some very public battles over compensation and credit. But in those early days, the money question was secondary to the cultural conversation. The Simpsons had arrived on a cultural landscape that was not fully prepared for it, and had begun reshaping that landscape in ways that were only partially visible in real time. The show was changing what animated television could be. It was changing what primetime television could say. And it was doing all of this while generating complaint letters, school board motions, presidential speeches, and television ratings that the network could not afford to ignore. While the political controversies were playing out in public, the internal battles with Fox were continuing on a different track. The relationship between the show's creative leadership and the network's corporate structure was never simple, and it became significantly more complicated as the show became more valuable. By the early 1990s, The Simpsons was not just a successful television series, it was a franchise. The merchandise alone was generating hundreds of millions of dollars. Bart Simpson was on t-shirts and lunchboxes and backpacks. The show's characters were licensing their likenesses to products ranging from cereal to video games to breakfast syrup. The financial stakes of the show had expanded far beyond the cost of producing 22 episodes per season. That expansion of stakes brought new pressures from the network, new interference in creative decisions, and new points of conflict that had nothing to do with the content of the show itself and everything to do with money and control. The writers and producers of The Simpsons were, from very early in the show's history, acutely aware that the thing they had built was generating enormous wealth for Fox, while the people who had built it saw a fraction of that wealth. The merchandising empire was particularly galling in this respect. Standard television contracts in that era gave the network significant control over licensing revenue, and the creators of The Simpsons found themselves watching a global phenomenon built from their characters and their jokes and their imagination, while the financial structure ensured that the network captured most of the value. This tension would eventually surface in explicit and public ways, but in those early years, it simmered quietly beneath the surface of the show's public success. What the outside world saw was a show that was winning awards, dominating ratings, and generating a level of cultural conversation that no animated series had ever managed. What the inside world experienced was a creative enterprise in constant negotiation with a corporate entity that did not always understand what it owned or why it worked. The censorship battles continued through the early and middle seasons, with the show gradually winning more ground as its ratings demonstrated that the audience was not, in fact, offended by what it was seeing. The complaints kept coming from organized pressure groups and from individual viewers, but the ratings told a different story. People were watching. People were watching in enormous numbers, and the show was winning the kind of critical recognition that made Fox eager to claim credit for its success while simultaneously being nervous about its content. That contradiction between the network's pride in the show's cultural status and its discomfort with the show's actual content would define the relationship between The Simpsons and Fox for years to come. It is worth noting that The Simpsons was not operating in isolation during this period. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a moment when American popular culture was broadly pushing against the boundaries of what had previously been acceptable in mainstream entertainment. Stand-up comedy was going places that television had not yet followed. Films were exploring territory that would have been impossible under the older studio system. The Simpsons was part of a broader cultural shift, but it was also accelerating it because it was doing this work inside living rooms during prime time, in a format that families were watching together, and it was getting away with it. The show's approach to religion deserves its own consideration, even within this broader section on early controversies, because it became one of the most consistent flashpoints across the show's entire run. The Simpsons depicted religious faith with a complexity that was genuinely unusual for American television. It was not contemptuous of belief. Homer's relationship with God, explored in multiple episodes across the show's run, was portrayed with a surprising degree of genuine sentiment. The show could be funny about religion without being dismissive of it, which is a harder balance to strike than it might appear. But the show also depicted organized religion, and specifically the institutional aspects of Christianity as experienced in small-town American life, in ways that organizations like the American Family Association found deeply objectionable. Reverend Lovejoy was a portrait of a man who had entered the ministry with some degree of genuine faith and had been ground down by decades of pastoral work into a kind of cheerful spiritual exhaustion. He was not evil. He was not a hypocrite in the dramatic sense. He was just tired, and his tiredness was somehow more unsettling to certain viewers than dramatic villainy would have been. The show's relationship with the Catholic Church was especially complicated and would generate some of the show's most discussed controversies in later seasons. But even in the early years, the general tone of The Simpsons toward religious institutions, which combined genuine affection for the role of faith in community life with sharp mockery of the institutional machinery through which that faith was administered, was enough to generate organized complaint. What sustained the show through all of this early turbulence was the quality of the work itself. The Simpsons was not surviving controversy through clever PR management or through the protection of powerful network executives who believed in its cultural mission. It was surviving because the show was genuinely, demonstrably excellent, and because the audience knew it. The people watching The Simpsons in 1991 and 1992 and 1993 knew they were watching something that was unlike anything else on television, something that was reaching for a kind of sustained, satirical intelligence that the medium had not previously demonstrated it was capable of. That quality created loyalty, and that loyalty created ratings, and those ratings created protection that no amount of complaint could fully erode. The show had come into existence in controversy and learned to wear that controversy as armor. Every ban became an advertisement, every presidential criticism became a cultural badge. Every organized complaint from a religious group became proof that the show was engaging with the real world in ways that mattered. The Simpsons understood, intuitively and then explicitly, that a show nobody complained about was a show nobody was really watching. Before we go further, if you're listening to this right now, drop a comment with where you're from and what time it is wherever you are. And if you want more deep dives like this one, subscribing takes about 2 seconds and it genuinely helps. Now let's keep going. Section 2. The Couch, the Crayon, and the Contract. Creator feuds and the writers' room wars. Matt Groening did not create The Simpsons alone, and the question of who deserves credit for what has been one of the show's quietest and most persistent points of tension for its entire existence. The story of how the show came to be, the real story rather than the simplified origin myth, involves a set of relationships that were complicated from the very beginning and that eventually fractured in ways the show never fully recovered from. The version of events that Groening has generally told places him at the center of the creation story. He was an underground cartoonist with a successful alternative comic strip called Life in Hell, when James L. Brooks, the legendary television and film producer, approached him about developing some animated material for a new comedy variety show that Fox was developing. That show would become The Tracy Ullman Show, which debuted in 1987, and it featured short animated interstitials between sketches that Groening created, featuring a crude, barely animated family. Those interstitials were the prototype for The Simpsons. They were rough, cheaply animated, and barely watched by most people who tuned into The Tracy Ullman Show. But something about them caught the attention of Fox executives, and when the idea of developing a full, half-hour animated series around the family was raised, Groening was involved from the start. But so was Sam Simon. Sam Simon was a television writer and producer who came onto The Simpsons as a co-developer and showrunner in its earliest period. His contribution to what the show became is, by most accounts from people who were in the writer's room at the time, foundational in ways that have been systematically undervalued in the public narrative of the show's creation. Simon helped shape the storytelling structure of the series, the approach to character development, the way the jokes were built and layered, the general philosophy that would make The Simpsons not just funny, but emotionally resonant in a way that contemporary animated shows were not. Understanding Sam Simon's contribution requires understanding what the show looked like before he got to work on it and what it looked like afterward. The Tracy Ullman interstitials, the source material from which the series was developed, were extremely raw. The characters were barely defined beyond their visual design. The family dynamic was sketched in very broad strokes. There was humor, certainly, but it was the humor of a cartoonist who was very good at visual gags and character sketches, not yet the humor of a long-form narrative comedy with real emotional architecture. Simon brought the architecture. He recruited writers who knew how to build stories, how to structure acts, how to make jokes earn their place within a scene rather than just sitting on top of it. He developed what would become the show's distinctive approach to balancing satirical distance with genuine emotional investment in its characters. The Simpson family under Simon's guidance became people you could care about even while the show was being relentlessly funny at their expense. Simon's relationship with Groening deteriorated quickly and bitterly. The exact nature of their disputes is documented in fragments across various interviews and accounts from writers who were present. And the picture that emerges is not flattering to either party. There were disputes over credit, over authority, over creative direction, over the basic question of whose show this actually was. By the time the series was hitting its stride in the early seasons, Simon had effectively stepped back from day-to-day involvement, and by the end of the fourth season, he was gone entirely. Simon reportedly received royalties from the show for the rest of his life under the terms of his original deal, which by any measure made him very wealthy, but the creative legacy question was never fully resolved. He gave several interviews in the years before his death in 2015 in which he described his contributions to the show's early development in terms that differed significantly from the story Groening had told publicly. Those interviews were widely read within the television industry. They did not change the mainstream narrative about the show's origins, because mainstream narratives about creative work tend to crystallize around the person whose name is in the opening credits, and that person was Matt Groening. The grief around Sam Simon's death had an added complexity because of the way he had spent the years after leaving The Simpsons. He had become increasingly philanthropic, donating enormous portions of his royalty income to animal welfare causes and other charitable work. He had been diagnosed with terminal colon cancer in 2012 and told he had 3 to 6 months to live, and then proceeded to outlive that estimate by nearly 3 years, during which time he gave away a substantial portion of his wealth. The contrast between his public image in his final years, generous and warm and deeply engaged with causes he cared about, and the bitterness of his departure from The Simpsons, added a particular melancholy to the whole story. The dynamic between writers and creators in television is almost always complicated, because television is fundamentally a collaborative medium that individual credit tends to obscure. The Simpsons, over the course of its run, employed hundreds of writers. Many of those writers went on to extraordinary careers in film and television, and a significant number of them have spoken at various points about what it was like to write for the show during different eras. The writers who were there during the Golden Age, roughly seasons 3 through 8, describe something close to a creative paradise. The room was full of extraordinarily talented people pushing each other to do better work. The standard for jokes was high enough that material that would have been the centerpiece of another show's episode might get cut from a Simpsons script because something better existed on the next page. The work was hard, and the hours were brutal, but the results justified it. Understanding the writer's room culture of The Simpsons at its peak requires appreciating how unusual the talent concentration was. This was not a group of competent television professionals doing solid journeyman work. This was a room that at various points included people who would go on to create Futurama, write for Late Night with Conan O'Brien, produce The Office, develop their own successful film careers, and win Emmy Awards working in multiple different genres. The Simpsons writers' room in the early and middle 1990s functioned like a graduate program for a very specific kind of comedic intelligence, and the alumni network it generated would reshape American comedy for decades. The writers who came in during the later seasons described something different. Not a creative paradise, but a creative institution. A system that had been built to produce a certain kind of output, and that continued producing that output through institutional momentum, rather than through the specific creative hunger that had animated the early years. The show had gotten very good at being The Simpsons, but whether it was still reaching for the thing that had made The Simpsons remarkable in the first place was a question that different people answered differently depending on when they had arrived and what they had experienced. The showrunner structure of The Simpsons is worth understanding because it is unusual. Most television series have a single showrunner for their entire run, or at most change showrunners once or twice when the creative leadership burns out or moves on. The Simpsons has had more than a dozen showrunners over its history, rotating through at a pace that reflects both the demands of the job and the way the show was structured to allow the creative team to evolve without the series itself being tied to any single person's vision. This structure was a strength in the early years. It allowed different creative voices to shape different eras of the show, preventing any single sensibility from calcifying into a formula. But it also created continuity problems, both in terms of narrative continuity and in terms of the kind of deep institutional knowledge that ensures a show remembers what it has said about its own characters. The joke about the show forgetting its own continuity is actually rooted in something real, which is that a show with dozens of rotating writers across hundreds of episodes covering 36 years will inevitably generate contradictions. Mike Rice, who was one of the showrunners during the early Golden Age, has written and spoken extensively about the writer's room experience. His accounts describe a creative culture that was intensely competitive in the best possible way, where the bar for what counted as a good joke was set by the most talented people in the room, and everyone else was working to clear it. The writing staff in those years included people who would go on to create or run some of the most successful comedies of the 1990s and 2000s. George Meyer is generally credited by people who were there as the single writer who contributed most to the distinctive voice of The Simpsons at its peak. His name is less famous outside of television circles than it should be because the specific nature of his contributions is difficult to quantify in a way that translates to public recognition. He was not a showrunner. He was a writer, and his gift was for a particular kind of absurdist, aggressive joke that found the darkest and funniest edge of any situation and cut directly to it. The Simpsons at its best sounds like George Meyer, even when he did not write the specific episode, because his sensibility permeated the room and raised the standard for what the show considered acceptable. David Merkin, Conan O'Brien, Greg Daniels, Ken Levine, John Vitti, John Swartzwelder. The roster of writers who passed through the show during its peak years reads like a hall of fame for a specific era of American comedy. Each brought something different. Each left something behind. And the cumulative effect of their combined contribution was a show that was firing on more creative cylinders simultaneously than almost anything else in the history of the medium. The departure of the Golden Age writers was not a single dramatic event. It was a gradual dispersal. People left when other opportunities became too good to pass up, when the creative challenge of the show began to feel less stimulating than it once had, when the institutional weight of producing a show that had already done everything started to feel heavier than the joy of doing it. Some left amicably, some left with grievances, and some never fully left, returning to write for the show periodically while maintaining primary commitments elsewhere. John Swartzwelder deserves particular mention because his departure was the quietest and his legacy the most discussed. Swartzwelder wrote the largest number of Simpsons episodes of any individual writer in the show's history, somewhere around 60 scripts, which is a staggering contribution to the texture of the show's most beloved era. His writing was characterized by a kind of aggressive absurdism that never called attention to itself. The jokes in a Swartzwelder script were often constructed in ways that defied conventional comedic logic, arriving from angles you did not anticipate and landing harder than you expected. After the September 11th attacks, Swartzwelder began working from home, rather than attending the writer's room, reportedly so he could continue to smoke cigarettes in his workspace at a time when California's indoor smoking laws had caught up with his habit. He would write scripts and submit them remotely, and they were good enough that the show accommodated this unusual arrangement. Then he stopped submitting scripts at all, and he simply was not there anymore. He has given very few interviews and maintains essentially no public profile, which makes him an unusual figure in an industry where profile maintenance is considered close to professionally mandatory. The Groening question is worth returning to because it became a source of public tension in a specific and interesting way. Groening's role in the show's day-to-day operation was, for most of the series' run, limited. He was the creator and the executive producer and the public face of the franchise, but the actual work of running the writer's room, of producing episodes, of making the hundreds of decisions that determine what a season of television looks and feels like. That work was done by the showrunners and the writing staff. Groening's involvement was closer to that of a founding architect who had moved on to other projects than to that of an active builder. This is not in itself unusual for television. The creator of a long-running series often steps back from operational involvement as the show matures and the production apparatus learns to sustain itself. What made it potentially significant was that Groening was simultaneously developing Futurama, the science fiction animated comedy that debuted on Fox in 1999, and that drew on the talent and resources of the broader animation community that The Simpsons had helped build. The relationship between Futurama's development and The Simpsons' ongoing production was a source of some internal friction. Writers who were still committed to The Simpsons were aware that Groening's creative attention was increasingly directed elsewhere. Whether this affected the show's quality during that period is a matter of genuine debate, because the late 1990s Simpsons was already in a transitional period for reasons that had nothing to do with Groening's other projects. The contracts that the show's creative principals operated under were renegotiated multiple times during the series' run, and each renegotiation was a moment of potential crisis. The economics of a show like The Simpsons, generating revenue not just from its broadcast rights, but from its extraordinary merchandising empire and increasingly from syndication deals that were among the most lucrative in television history, made the question of compensation genuinely complicated. The writers who had built the show in its early years had done so under contracts that did not anticipate what the show would become, and the process of adjusting those contracts to reflect the show's actual value was, in several cases, contentious. The voice cast had their own contract dramas, which we will get to in a later section, but the writers and producers had their own version of the same basic dispute, which was that the people who had created something extraordinarily valuable were trying to negotiate for a share of that value from a corporation that preferred to define their contribution as narrowly as possible. The creative tensions within the show's history are impossible to separate from the financial ones, because in the entertainment industry, credit and money are almost always the same argument, wearing different clothes. The disputes over who really created The Simpsons, over whose contribution mattered most, over which era of the show represented its true self. These were also arguments about who deserved what portion of the extraordinary wealth the show had generated. And those arguments never fully resolved, because the show kept going. And the wealth kept accumulating, and the original participants kept aging into new relationships with what they had built. What remained constant through all of the disputes and departures and renegotiations and public grievances was the audience. The people who loved The Simpsons loved it in a way that was personal and deeply felt, and they watched the internal controversies with the anxiety of people observing the private life of something they cared about. The show's behind-the-scenes dramas became part of its legend, and the legend kept growing. Section 3. The Voice That Shook Springfield. Pay disputes, near cancellations, and the actors who almost walked. There is a version of history in which The Simpsons ended in 1998, then another version in which it ended in 2004, then another version in which it ended in 2011, and yet another in which it stopped in 2020. In each of these alternate timelines, the reason for the ending is the same. The voice cast went on strike, or threatened to, or actually sat down at a negotiating table and made clear that they would not continue under the terms the network was offering. The story of the voice actors and their relationship with Fox is one of the most dramatic labor stories in television history, and it played out over decades, across multiple contract cycles, with the stakes rising at each renegotiation, as the show proved its extraordinary durability and its extraordinary profitability. To understand why the contracts mattered so much, you have to understand what the voice cast had originally agreed to. In 1989, when The Simpsons was a new and unproven quantity, the 6 core voice actors signed deals that were reasonable by the standards of the time, but that made no provision for the possibility that the show would become one of the most successful franchises in entertainment history. Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, Nancy Cartwright, Yeardley Smith, Hank Azaria, and Harry Shearer were paid per episode, and the per-episode rate, while not insubstantial, did not reflect the kind of participation in the show's broader financial success that actors on extraordinarily profitable properties might expect. The original per-episode rate was somewhere in the range of $5,000 to $10,000 per episode, figures that were modest even by late 1980s television standards for regular cast members on a network show. The performers were not stars when they signed. They were working actors taking a job that seemed interesting and that paid what seemed like reasonable money. Nobody at the table was thinking about what the show would become, because nobody could have known. As the show grew and the merchandising revenues and the syndication deals became public knowledge, the disparity between what the show was generating and what the performers who gave the characters their voices were earning became increasingly difficult to ignore. The first major contract dispute came in the mid-1990s, when the cast negotiated a significant pay increase that raised their per-episode fee to approximately $125,000. This was big news at the time because it was substantially more than most television actors were earning per episode, but it still left the cast with no piece of the enormous ancillary revenues the show was generating. The second major renegotiation, around 1998, pushed the per-episode fee higher still to somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000. The numbers were becoming genuinely extraordinary by the standards of any industry, but the cast was negotiating against the backdrop of a show that was generating literally billions of dollars in total revenue, and the math of their share of that total remained small. To understand why the cast was in a position to negotiate successfully at all, you have to understand what the alternatives looked like to Fox. I thought. The characters of The Simpsons are not fictional constructions in the abstract sense that, say, James Bond is a fictional construction. James Bond can be recast because the character exists independently of any specific actor's interpretation. He is defined by written description, by narrative role, by a set of visual and behavioral characteristics that survive the replacement of one actor with another. The Simpsons characters are different. Homer Simpson is not primarily a visual design or a narrative role. Homer Simpson is a voice. The voice is the character in a way that is unusually direct and unusually complete. Dan Castellaneta's Homer is so specific, so recognizable, so deeply associated with every emotional and comedic note the character strikes, that the idea of a different voice delivering those lines is genuinely disorienting. This is what gave the cast their leverage. Fox could theoretically replace any one of them. It could not realistically replace all of them simultaneously, and it could not replace any of them without significant creative disruption and audience backlash. The cast understood this, and they used that understanding at the negotiating table. The most dramatic contract crisis came in 2004, when all 6 core cast members negotiated together, presenting a unified front that Fox found genuinely alarming. The cast was asking for a per-episode fee of approximately $360,000, which would have made them among the highest-paid performers in television. Fox's response was to threaten to replace the entire cast with new voice actors, a move that would have been technically possible but creatively catastrophic. The public conversation around this standoff was remarkable. It played out in the entertainment press over weeks, with reports about the state of negotiations, about Fox's willingness to recast, about the cast's solidarity and their refusal to negotiate individually. The show's producers found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being caught between the network and the performers without whom the show literally could not exist in its current form. The cast won, substantially, though not entirely on the terms they had originally requested. The new contract set the per-episode fee in the range of $300,000, and it secured the cast's involvement through multiple additional seasons. The settlement was widely interpreted as a significant victory for the performers, and a recognition that their contribution to the show's value was irreplaceable. The 2011 renegotiation was even more fraught. By that point, the economics of the television industry had shifted significantly, and Fox was taking a harder line on all of its programming costs. The network proposed that the cast accept a 45% pay cut, arguing that the show's ratings had declined from their peak and that the cost structure needed to reflect current market conditions rather than the show's historical success. The cast, again negotiating collectively, refused. The impasse lasted long enough that the show's future was genuinely uncertain. Fox made clear that the show could not continue at current cost levels, and that if the cast would not accept reduced compensation, the show would end. The cast made clear that accepting a 45% pay cut was not something they were willing to do. For a period of weeks, the most successful animated series in television history was genuinely in danger of cancellation, not because of ratings, not because of creative exhaustion, but because the people who made it could not agree on how to divide the money it was generating. The resolution came through a compromise that included a pay cut, though a smaller one than Fox had originally demanded, and additional compensation structures that gave the cast a small percentage of the show's profits. This profit participation, while modest in percentage terms, amounted to substantial additional income given the scale of the show's revenue, and it represented something the cast had been seeking for years: a genuine stake in the enterprise they had helped build. Harry Shearer's relationship with the show has its own complicated chapter. Shearer voices an extraordinary number of the show's characters, including Mr. Burns, Ned Flanders, Principal Skinner, Kent Brockman, Dr. Hibbert, Lenny, and dozens of secondary and recurring roles. The breadth of his contribution to the show's sonic landscape is almost impossible to overstate, and yet Shearer has been the cast member whose relationship with the show has been most openly contentious over the years. Shearer publicly contemplated leaving the show on multiple occasions. The reasons cited varied, but they consistently touched on the question of creative control, of what the actors were and were not permitted to do with the characters they had developed and the voices they had created. Shearer felt with some justification that the show's corporate structure left the performers in a position where they had built something genuinely valuable and yet had little say in how that thing was used or protected. When Shearer did voice concerns publicly, the response from the show's producers and from Fox was often defensive, in ways that seemed to confirm rather than dispel the underlying tensions. The performers were, in the view of the corporate apparatus, employees who delivered a service. In the view of Shearer and his colleagues, they were creative partners whose specific contributions had made the enterprise what it was. These two positions are not inherently irreconcilable, but the specific terms of their contracts and the specific culture of the entertainment industry in that era tended to reinforce the first view at the expense of the second. In 2015, Shearer actually announced he was leaving the show. The announcement came via Twitter in a message that was characteristically direct, and it set off a period of genuine uncertainty about what would happen to the dozens of characters he voiced. Fox indicated it was prepared to recast those roles. Shearer's representatives and the show's producers continued negotiating. After several weeks, Shearer reached a new agreement and returned. The incident illuminated something about the show's unusual situation. It had reached a scale and a cultural significance where the normal rules of television employment did not quite apply. The characters Shearer voiced were not just roles in a television series. They were cultural artifacts. Mr. Burns and Ned Flanders and Kent Brockman were entities that existed in the cultural consciousness in ways that went far beyond their weekly appearances on television. The idea of recasting them, of putting new voices behind faces that had been associated with specific vocal performances for a quarter century, was genuinely alarming in a way that recasting a role in an ordinary dramatic series would not be. This is the strange reality of what The Simpsons' longevity had created. The show had run long enough that the performers were no longer just actors doing a job. They were custodians of cultural heritage, and that custody gave them a kind of leverage that ordinary employment relationships do not generate. The near cancellations that did not involve contract disputes deserve their own accounting because there were moments across the show's history when the question of whether it should continue was genuinely in the air. The most serious of these came around seasons 11 and 12, when the show's ratings had declined significantly from their peak and the critical consensus had begun to shift. The dominant narrative in the entertainment press was that The Simpsons had passed its creative peak and was now in a long, slow decline. This narrative was both accurate and overstated. The show was not as good as it had been in seasons 4 through 8. The consensus on this point is essentially universal among people who have watched the show carefully over time, including many of the people who made it. But the decline from extraordinary to merely excellent is a kind of decline that many television programs would be grateful to experience, and the audience was still large enough to justify the show's continuation by any reasonable commercial metric. Fox's relationship with The Simpsons during this period was complicated by the network's desire to develop the next Simpsons, the show that would replicate the franchise's cultural dominance and commercial success for a new generation. Fox had invested in King of the Hill and Family Guy and various other animated properties during the late 1990s and early 2000s, all partly motivated by the desire to find a companion to or successor to The Simpsons. Family Guy in particular became a case study in unexpected audience loyalty, being canceled in 2002 and then revived in 2005 after strong DVD sales and Adult Swim ratings demonstrated that the audience was more devoted than the original cancellation had suggested. The Simpsons watched all of this from its position as the longest-running entry in the genre it had pioneered, aware that it had outlasted the standard for how long such things were supposed to last. The show had already been running longer than most of its competitors had existed when the first serious discussions about its sunset began. And yet it kept going, sustained by the combination of a still substantial audience, the economic engine of its syndication and streaming rights, and the institutional momentum of being the most successful franchise Fox had ever produced. The voice cast's role in all of this was both celebrated and occasionally resented within the industry. Their compensation had become a well-known data point in entertainment labor discussions, cited both by people arguing that talent deserved to share in the success their work created, and by people arguing that the costs of established talent had become a structural impediment to the industry's ability to develop new properties. The actors themselves were largely diplomatic in their public statements about all of this, aware that they were operating in a business where bridges, once burned, stay burned. What gets lost in the contract discussions is the artistry of what these performers actually do. The voice acting in The Simpsons, particularly during the show's peak years, is among the finest in the history of animation. Dan Castellaneta's Homer evolved from a somewhat crude early characterization into a fully realized comic creation with a voice that could carry genuine pathos alongside the pratfalls and the absurdity. Julie Kavner's Marge has a quality to it that is genuinely irreplaceable, a warmth and a weariness that communicates something true about a certain kind of American life. Nancy Cartwright made Bart both more sympathetic and more genuinely anarchic than the character appeared on the page. Yeardley Smith brought to Lisa a specifically tuned combination of righteous earnestness and social loneliness that gives the character her emotional core. These are performances in the deepest sense, and the fact that they were delivered in a recording booth rather than on a stage or a set does not diminish them. The recording process itself, which evolved over the years from group sessions where the cast recorded together and fed off each other's energy to more individualized sessions that were more technically efficient but perhaps less spontaneous, is another dimension of the show's labor history that has received less attention than the contract disputes. The earliest seasons were recorded with the full cast in the booth together, which meant that the performances had a specific kind of natural chemistry that came from actors actually responding to each other in real time. As the show's production became more industrialized, the sessions became more segmented, and the texture of the performances changed in ways that are subtle but real. The contracts, the disputes, the near walkouts, and the actual departures and the eventual returns. All of it was, underneath the business language, a negotiation about what these performances were worth. The numbers that emerged from those negotiations were large. They were large because the performances were extraordinary. And the show kept going, in part because those performances kept being delivered. Section 4. Did they predict it or did they cause it? The prophecy controversy. The internet, over the past 2 decades, has developed a particular obsession with a question that sounds simple but turns out to be genuinely interesting once you sit with it. Did The Simpsons predict the future? And if so, how? The show has been airing since 1989. In those decades, it has produced nearly 800 episodes across thousands of individual scenes containing tens of thousands of specific visual and narrative details. At that volume, the probability of any given future event having some kind of structural parallel to something that appeared in a Simpsons episode at some point is quite high, not because the show is prophetic, but because the show is vast. And yet the specific examples that keep circulating are striking enough to give you pause, not because they prove prophecy, but because they reveal something interesting about how the show worked and what kind of intelligence was shaping it. The most frequently cited example, the one that has generated the most discussion and the most breathless social media posts, is the episode from 2000, in which Donald Trump is depicted as a future president of the United States. The episode in question, Bart to the Future, aired in March 2000, more than 16 years before Trump actually took office. In the episode, a future Lisa Simpson has become president and is dealing with a budget deficit left behind by President Trump. The joke, in context, was that Trump as president was an obvious absurdity, a punchline rather than a prediction. The humor derived from the idea that something so ridiculous could happen. The writer of that episode, Dan Greeny, was interviewed multiple times after 2016 and gave remarkably candid accounts of what the joke was actually intended to mean. He described it as a satirical warning rather than a genuine prediction, an attempt to illustrate how the logic of celebrity culture, if followed to its conclusion, might produce exactly that kind of political outcome. The joke landed in 2000 as obvious exaggeration. 16 years later, it was replaying on news programs as evidence of the show's prophetic powers. The distinction between prediction and pattern recognition is crucial here, and The Simpsons cases illustrate it beautifully. The show has always been written by extraordinarily intelligent people who were paying close attention to the world. When they wrote a joke about a scenario that seemed absurd in one decade and became reality in the next, they were usually not guessing that the specific thing would happen. They were identifying a direction in which existing cultural or political or technological trends were pointing and following that direction to its comic extreme. When the extreme turned out not to be as extreme as they thought, the joke looked like prophecy. The smartwatch episode is another example. The show depicted a device that looked very much like an Apple Watch in a 1995 episode, nearly 2 decades before the actual product launched. But 1995 was also a moment when the concept of wrist-worn computing devices was being actively discussed in technology circles and appearing in science fiction. The show's writers were reading the right magazines and imagining where the technology was going. That is not prophecy. That is informed extrapolation. But it looks a lot like prophecy once the extrapolation turns out to have been accurate. The three-eyed fish named Blinky, which appeared in an early episode as a consequence of pollution from the nuclear plant, became a real-world observation when a three-eyed fish was actually discovered near a nuclear facility in Argentina in 2011. The timing created an obvious media story, and the comparison was irresistible. But three-eyed fish are a known consequence of certain kinds of environmental contamination, and the show's writers were making a joke about nuclear pollution that was grounded in real environmental science. The discovery of an actual three-eyed fish near an actual nuclear facility was not the show predicting the future. It was the show being correct about science. The September 11th visual reference occupies a different category. A 1997 episode featured a New York City travel brochure in which the Twin Towers were visible near the number 9, in a layout that some viewers interpreted after the fact as a reference to the attacks. This is the category of pattern recognition that requires the most skepticism, because it depends on finding meaning in a coincidental arrangement of visual elements that were not designed to carry that meaning. The towers appeared in the image because they were the most prominent feature of the Manhattan skyline. The number 9 appeared in the price on the brochure. These elements were not placed in relationship to each other by someone imagining a future catastrophe. They were placed there by animators filling in background detail, and the meaning was supplied by viewers looking at the image from the perspective of grief. The Ebola example is particularly interesting because it surfaced as a social media talking point in 2014, when the actual Ebola outbreak was dominating international news coverage. The 1998 episode in question featured a book called Curious George and the Ebola Virus, visible for a single frame as a background detail. Someone with extremely attentive eyes had noticed it years earlier, and the image circulated widely in 2014 as evidence of the show's prediction abilities. In fact, Ebola had been known to medical science since its first documented outbreak in 1976. The reference in the episode was a dark joke about an existing disease, not a prediction of a future epidemic. The 2020 pandemic produced its own wave of Simpsons prediction claims. The 1993 episode Marge in Chains, in which a flu virus originating from overseas spreads to Springfield and causes panic buying, was widely shared as evidence that the show had predicted the coronavirus pandemic. The visual similarities between the fictional outbreak and the real one were genuinely striking in some respects. The panic buying sequence in particular resonated with anyone who had watched the toilet paper crises of early 2020. But the episode was not predicting a pandemic. It was depicting one using a standard disaster movie template, and the elements it included were standard elements of how epidemics spread and how populations respond. The show got these elements right because they are real features of how infectious disease works, not because it had supernatural foreknowledge. The prediction conversation has also generated its own minor controversies, separate from the question of whether the show is actually prophetic. There are academic papers about the phenomenon. There are entire websites devoted to cataloging purported examples. There are people who approach the archive of the show's episodes with the specific intention of finding moments that anticipate future events, and who are willing to stretch the definition of anticipation quite significantly to increase the count of hits. The confirmation bias dimension of the prediction phenomenon deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Simpsons has also made thousands of specific predictions about the future that did not come true. Jetpacks never became common. Flying cars remained science fiction. Various specific political and cultural scenarios depicted in the show's future-oriented episodes have not materialized. Nobody compiles these misses. Nobody shares screenshots of The Simpsons being wrong. The hits get remembered and the misses get forgotten, and the aggregate of remembered hits, stripped of the forgotten misses, looks like a remarkable track record that is actually just the product of a large sample size. The show's creative team has generally responded to the prediction narrative with a mixture of amusement and mild exasperation. Amusement because the examples are sometimes genuinely striking, and because the conversation keeps the show culturally relevant in ways that pure nostalgia would not. Exasperation because the framing tends to obscure what the show was actually doing, which was paying careful attention to the world and following its logic. The writers did not want credit for predicting the future. They wanted credit for understanding the present, and the prediction narrative, while flattering in a way, missed the more interesting thing they had actually done. There is a reasonable argument that the most interesting version of the prediction phenomenon is not about prophecy at all, but about influence. Some of what looks like The Simpsons predicting the future might be better understood as The Simpsons influencing people who then went on to create the future. Product designers who grew up watching the show, who were shaped by its specific vision of technology and culture and absurdity, may have carried elements of that vision into their professional work. The Apple Watch may resemble the Simpsons smartwatch, not because the show predicted it, but because people who worked on the Apple Watch had watched The Simpsons and unconsciously incorporated that image of what a wrist computer could look like. This is genuinely difficult to prove and genuinely interesting to consider. Popular culture does not just observe the world. It shapes what the people who consume it expect and imagine and eventually build. A show that reaches hundreds of millions of people over 3 decades and that engages seriously with questions about technology and politics and culture will inevitably have some effect on what those people consider possible or desirable. The prediction phenomenon, understood this way, is not about prophecy. It is about the relationship between imagination and reality, and about the specific kind of cultural power that a show accumulates when it runs long enough and reaches widely enough to have shaped the people who will eventually build the world. The Cypress Hill and London Symphony Orchestra example is one of the more delightful specific cases. In 1996, a Simpsons episode featured the hip-hop group accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra. In 2024, Cypress Hill actually performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. The gap between the joke and its real-world realization was 28 years. Did the episode predict this? Almost certainly not. Did someone involved in making that collaboration happen grow up watching the episode and find the idea charming? That is possible, and if true, it represents a form of cultural influence that is more interesting than prediction. The predictions aren't supernatural. They aren't conspiratorial. They are the natural result of a brilliantly written show running for an impossible length of time, staffed by highly educated observers of American culture, producing more satirical content than any other show in television history, and then having that content filtered through the confirmation bias engine of the internet, which selects for the hits and buries the misses. The Simpsons didn't predict the future. The Simpsons wrote so many possible futures that some of them were bound to come true. and the ones that came true are the only ones anyone remembers. But try telling that to the internet the next time a Simpsons clip from 1997 lines up perfectly with a headline from this year. Because the truth is, even knowing how the trick works, it is still impressive to watch. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations, and enough hits to make even the show's own creators occasionally wonder if they know something they shouldn't. Section 5. The Church, the Censors, and the Complaints. Religious and cultural backlash. If there is one thread that runs through the entire history of The Simpsons and its relationship with organized opposition, it is the thread that connects to faith. The show has offended religious groups in virtually every season of its run, and it has done so not through contempt, but through a particular kind of satirical affection that certain kinds of believers find even more offensive than contempt would be. The difference matters. The Simpsons is not an atheist's show, in the sense that it does not treat religious faith as simply a form of delusion held by stupid people. Homer's relationship with God is one of the more honestly rendered spiritual relationships in American popular culture. The episode in which Homer decides to stop going to church and argues with God about it. In a dream, receiving a somewhat sympathetic hearing from an almighty who seems to find organized religion as complicated as Homer does, is a piece of genuine theological comedy that takes its subject seriously even as it finds it funny. The show respects faith enough to engage with it, and the result is something more interesting and more provocative than dismissal would produce. But the respect did not satisfy the objectors. If anything, the show's engagement with religious themes from a position of genuine interest rather than clear hostility made it harder to dismiss and easier to resent. You cannot simply ignore something that is paying serious attention to the things you care about and finding them funny. That is more threatening than contempt. The American Family Association became one of the show's most consistent critics in its early years. Founded by Donald Wildman, the organization specialized in organizing pressure campaigns against advertisers that sponsored programming it found objectionable, and The Simpsons was on its target list from relatively early in the show's run. The AFA's concerns were about the show's general attitude toward authority and family values, its depiction of religious figures as ordinary and fallible, and the cumulative message it sent about what was acceptable behavior. The advertiser pressure strategy was the AFA's primary tool, and it had some effect. Certain brands did pull advertising from specific episodes during specific periods. But the show's ratings were strong enough that the advertising slots filled quickly with other sponsors, and the overall commercial impact of the organized pressure was limited. The AFA claimed various victories over the years, but the show continued, and its cultural prominence grew. Each campaign seemed to demonstrate mainly that the audience for The Simpsons was more loyal and more comfortable with the show's content than the AFA's membership was, and that the advertisers who remained associated with the show were not seriously damaged by the association. The Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights took a particular interest in the show's treatment of Catholicism, which was itself a somewhat unusual subject for American primetime entertainment. The Simpsons engaged with Catholic traditions and imagery in ways that were sometimes reverent and sometimes satirical. And the Catholic League found the satirical instances deeply objectionable regardless of whether they were paired with genuine engagement. The show's specific relationship with Catholic imagery is worth examining in some detail because it goes beyond the straightforward satirizing of organized religion that characterized the show's treatment of Protestant Christianity. The Simpsons has depicted crucifixes, confession, papal authority, and specific Catholic theological concepts in ways that ranged from affectionate to pointed. Several episodes used Catholic ritual as a backdrop for comedy in ways that assumed a sophisticated audience familiarity with the specific practices being depicted. This sophistication of reference worked against the show in a specific way with religious critics. It was impossible to claim that the show was simply ignorant of what it was depicting. The jokes were too specific, too knowledgeable, too evidently written by people who understood the traditions they were satirizing. Ignorant mockery is easier to dismiss than informed mockery, and The Simpsons was almost always the latter. An episode from the early seasons in which Homer briefly becomes a born-again Christian generated organized opposition from evangelical groups that felt the depiction was condescending. The episode presented Homer's conversion with a mixture of genuine sympathy and satirical distance, showing the appeal of evangelical community while also being clear about Homer's failure to maintain the commitments he had made. The criticism from evangelical organizations was that the episode's ultimate message was dismissive of genuine faith, that it treated conversion as a phase rather than a transformation. The show's writers would have argued that the episode was about Homer specifically rather than about evangelical Christianity generally, and that Homer's inability to sustain any serious commitment, spiritual or otherwise, was consistent with everything the show had established about his character. The Jewish community's relationship with the show is its own fascinating chapter. Krusty the Clown, one of the show's most beloved recurring characters, is the son of a rabbi and has a relationship with his Jewish identity that is complex and funny and, as mand, in several episodes, genuinely moving. The episodes that explored Krusty's family history and his estrangement from his father were some of the most emotionally resonant the show produced, treating the specific textures of Jewish American generational conflict with a care that reflected the writing staff's direct familiarity with the subject. The show's treatment of Jewish culture was shaped partly by the fact that a significant portion of its writing staff was Jewish, which meant that the jokes about Jewish identity came from the inside rather than the outside. This gave them a quality that most Jewish American comedy commentary recognized as authentic, even when it was finding funny things about the community. The self-deprecation of the Jewish humor in The Simpsons had the specific flavor of people making jokes about themselves, which is different from and generally preferable to people making jokes about others. The show's relationship with Islam was more limited and more careful. In an era when depictions of Islamic faith in American media were frequently stereotyped or simply absent, The Simpsons maintained a careful distance from the subject, engaging with it rarely, and when it did, with an evident awareness of the specific sensitivities involved. The show could be fearless about Christianity, about Judaism, about various minority religious practices, but its engagement with Islam was circumspect in ways that reflected both genuine respect and perhaps some degree of institutional caution about the consequences of any perceived misstep. International reception of the show's religious content followed the same basic pattern as domestic reception, but with significant variation by country. In Catholic countries in Europe and Latin America, certain episodes generated controversy that they had not produced in the American context. The show was dubbed and broadcast in dozens of languages and territories, and the process of adaptation sometimes softened or altered the religious references to accommodate local sensitivities and, in some cases, local laws governing broadcast content. The Italian dubbing of The Simpsons became its own subject of cultural commentary. Italy, with its significant Catholic heritage and its complex relationship to American popular culture, provided an interesting test case for how the show's religious satire translated across cultural boundaries. The Italian versions of certain episodes adjusted specific references to reflect the different cultural weight those references would carry for an Italian audience, and the result was a somewhat different experience of the show's religious comedy than the original American version provided. The Brazilian localization of The Simpsons became its own minor controversy. Brazilian audiences were accustomed to dubbing that preserved the general spirit of American content while making adjustments for local sensibilities, and the Simpsons dubbing team in Brazil developed a version of the show with distinct local references and a specific energy that was somewhat different from the American original. In the Middle East, The Simpsons went through an adaptation process that generated significant media coverage. The Simpsons was adapted for Arabic language broadcast as Al-Shamshun, with Homer renamed Omar, the family made to be Muslim, and the content adjusted to reflect local values. Beer was replaced with non-alcoholic soda. The donuts were replaced with Egyptian cookies. The show's essential comedic engine was preserved, but the specific cultural scaffolding that made the American version what it was had been substantially rebuilt. The adaptation was not particularly successful in ratings terms, which may have had something to do with how difficult it is to separate a cultural artifact from its cultural context. The specific things that make Homer Homer, his specific relationship to American consumer culture, his specific brand of domestic frustration, are bound up with the specific setting that generates them. The organized religious opposition to The Simpsons in the United States operated within a specific political context, which is that the culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s were a real and significant feature of American political life, and popular entertainment was one of the primary battlegrounds. Television programs, films, popular music, and video games were all subjects of organized religious and conservative criticism during this period, and The Simpsons was a prominent target not just because of its content, but because of its popularity. What made The Simpsons a particularly interesting target for religious critics was that it was not obscure or edgy in the way that genuinely provocative content could be defended as niche. It was mainstream. It was the most watched show in its demographic. It was the show that American families were watching together on Sunday nights. The idea that this show was undermining values was alarming in a way that something confined to late-night cable would not have been, because this show was inside the family living room. The censors within Fox had their own ongoing relationship with the show's religious content, separate from the external organized pressure. The network's Standards and Practices Department continued to review episodes for content that might generate advertiser concerns, and religious subjects were among the categories that received particular scrutiny. The writers learned which approaches to religious satire would clear the standards process and which would require negotiation, and they became expert at making the arguments for why specific jokes were worth keeping. Some of the most memorable religious jokes in the show's history required extended advocacy from the writers to survive the censorship process. The episode in which Homer meets God and the two have a conversation, with God depicted as a fully rendered character with a recognizable face, required significant back and forth between the writers and the standards department. The worry was not that God was being portrayed disrespectfully, but that depicting God visually at all in any form might generate enough organized objection to create a significant public relations problem for the network. The writer's argument, which eventually prevailed, was that depicting God as a character who has a relationship with Homer, who finds Homer's questions interesting, who does not punish his irreverence with thunderbolts, was actually a more respectful and more genuinely engaging portrayal of divine presence than the complete avoidance of the subject would have been. Whether the objectors agreed with this argument is doubtful. But the argument won the internal debate, and the episode aired, and God got a face, and Homer got an audience with the divine, and the world did not end. The religious controversy around The Simpsons has a coda that is worth noting. In the later seasons, as the culture's specific anxieties shifted and as the show's religious satire became less novel, through sheer familiarity, the organized religious opposition to the show quieted somewhat. Not because the show became less irreverent, it did not, but the specific battles of the culture wars that had made The Simpsons such a flashpoint in the 1990s evolved into different battles, and the show was no longer at the center of the new ones. It had become, in a sense, grandfathered into acceptability. The irreverence that had once seemed threatening had become familiar, and familiarity, in cultural terms, is a form of domestication. The complaints about the show's religious content were, in the end, a symptom of the same thing that all the other complaints were symptoms of. The Simpsons was doing something real. It was engaging with things that mattered to people, finding them funny in ways that were recognizable, and refusing to treat the sacred as exempt from scrutiny. That refusal was genuine and consistent, and in the long view of the show's history, one of its defining qualities. Section 6. The episode they locked away. Banned, pulled, and delayed. Every long-running television series has episodes that did not air when planned, or that aired in some markets but not others, or that were quietly removed from syndication packages after some controversy made their continued circulation uncomfortable. The Simpsons, across 36 seasons, has accumulated a small but genuinely significant collection of these episodes, and the stories behind them reveal as much about the show's cultural context as any of the episodes that aired without incident. The most discussed of the pulled episodes, in terms of an institutional decision by the show itself, is Stark Raving Dad, which we have already covered in the context of Michael Jackson. But there are numerous other examples of episodes that faced significant obstacles between creation and distribution, for reasons ranging from animation disasters to diplomatic sensitivity to genuine tragedy. The first episode that ever gave the production team serious cause for concern was Some Enchanted Evening, which was the last episode produced in the first season, even though it aired later, and which became a cautionary tale about what happens when the animation production process goes seriously wrong. The episode had been farmed out to an animation studio, as was standard practice for the show, but the results that came back were so poor, so far below even the already modest baseline of first season Simpsons animation quality, that significant portions of the episode had to be completely redone. To understand why this was catastrophic, you have to understand the production timeline of an animated series. Animation has a long lead time. Episodes are written, storyboarded, recorded, animated, edited, and post-produced across a process that typically takes 6 to 9 months from script to broadcast. When a major animation problem is discovered late in that process, the options are limited and none of them are good. Delay the episode and disrupt the broadcast schedule. Air it as it is and damage the show's quality reputation. Or spend the time and money to fix it, which pushes everything else back. The show chose to fix it, and the experience shaped how the production managed its overseas animation partners for the rest of the series. Specific technical standards were established. Storyboards were reviewed more carefully before being sent to animation studios. The quality control infrastructure that characterizes the show's mature production process was built largely in response to the near disaster of Some Enchanted Evening. The episode that generated the most geographically specific distribution controversy was The City of New York versus Homer Simpson, the Season 9 premiere. The episode aired in 1997 and was set largely in and around the World Trade Center area of Manhattan. After September 11, 2001, the episode was pulled from syndication rotation by broadcasters who felt that its visual focus on the Twin Towers was inappropriate given the recent tragedy. This decision was made not by the show's producers, but by the individual television stations and cable networks that held syndication rights, and the result was that for a period of years, the episode was essentially invisible to American viewers. The specific scenes that drew the most concern were not dramatic by any standard. They simply showed the towers as part of the New York skyline, which the episode's plot required since a significant portion of the story involved Homer navigating the area around them. The controversy was not about the content of the episode, but about the discomfort of seeing those particular buildings rendered in animation after they no longer existed in reality. The episode eventually returned to syndication, though different broadcasters made the decision to restore it at different times. When it came back, the conversation around its return was itself a kind of cultural document, a record of how the culture had processed the specific grief of that particular absence in the New York skyline, and how that processing had reached a point where the ordinary presence of the towers and archival entertainment was no longer too painful to bear. The episode Goo Goo Gai Pan, which aired in 2005, generated international controversy of a different kind. The episode involves the Simpson family traveling to China to adopt a baby, and it was banned in China entirely. The episode depicted various aspects of Chinese culture and government in ways that Chinese authorities found objectionable, including references to Tiananmen Square and depictions of Chinese bureaucracy that implied criticism of the government. The Chinese ban on the episode was widely reported in international media, which created exactly the kind of attention that bans generally produce. The diplomatic dimension of the controversy was handled carefully by Fox, which had significant commercial interests in the Chinese market that went beyond The Simpsons specifically. The entertainment industry's relationship with China during this period was already complex, as studios were attempting to navigate the balance between creative freedom and access to a market that was becoming increasingly important to global box office and licensing revenues. Blame It on Lisa, from 2002, generated a diplomatic incident of a relatively minor but genuinely amusing kind. The episode involves the Simpsons traveling to Brazil, and its depiction of that country drew a formal complaint from the Brazilian Ministry of Tourism, which objected to the episode's portrayal of Brazil as a chaotic, dangerous place with rampant crime, kidnapping, and poverty. The Brazilian government issued an official statement criticizing the episode and called it offensive to Brazilian citizens. The show's producers responded with a mixture of amusement and mild defensiveness, noting that the episode was satirical rather than documentary, and that many of the elements being objected to were exaggerations for comic effect. The Brazilian government was not satisfied with this response. The implicit argument from the Brazilian side was that stereotypical depictions of the country, regardless of their satirical framing, caused real harm by shaping how millions of viewers understood Brazil and Brazilians. This argument is not unreasonable, and it connects to the broader questions about representation that the Apu controversy would make explicit more than a decade later. The episode The Cartridge Family, which dealt with gun ownership and centered on Homer acquiring a handgun, was preemptively pulled by several international broadcasters before it aired and generated significant controversy domestically. In countries with stricter gun control laws and different cultural relationships to firearms, the episode's premise, that an ordinary American man could easily acquire a handgun at a gun show with essentially no obstacles, read less as satire and more as a disturbing window into American culture. Domestically, the episode's handling of the gun issue was surprisingly nuanced by television standards. It did not advocate for the removal of all firearms, nor did it present gun ownership as unambiguously positive. It depicted Homer's acquisition of a gun as something that had genuine consequences, including genuine danger to his family, while also acknowledging the complex cultural role that gun ownership plays in American life. Homer's relationship with the gun, his initial excitement followed by the specific problems the gun created, track something true about how firearm ownership actually plays out in many American households. That nuance was exactly what made certain advocacy groups on both sides of the gun debate uncomfortable. The episode was not a clear endorsement of either position, which made it harder to use as a piece of cultural ammunition. The NRA and its allies could not simply embrace it, because it showed gun ownership creating family danger. Gun control advocates could not simply condemn it, because it acknowledged the genuine appeal of firearm ownership rather than dismissing it. The episode Homer's Enemy introduced a character named Frank Grimes, and while the episode itself was not banned or pulled, it became one of the most discussed and debated pieces of work the show ever produced precisely because of how it handled the question of what the show's premise actually meant if you took it seriously. Frank Grimes was a man who had worked hard all his life, achieved modest success through genuine effort, and was now watching Homer Simpson, a man who appeared to make no effort at anything, live a comfortable and loving life without apparent consequence for his laziness and incompetence. The episode works as a kind of experimental probe of the show's own internal logic, asking what would happen if someone genuinely rational looked at Homer and found him not funny but insane. Grimes's destruction by this encounter, his eventual psychotic break and death, is played with a darkness that made some viewers profoundly uncomfortable. The episode received some of the most mixed critical reception of any highly regarded Simpsons episode, praised by those who found its darkness bracingly honest and criticized by those who felt it was punishing the wrong character for recognizing something real. The argument of the episode's defenders is that Frank Grimes dies not because the show is punishing his rationality, but because the show is acknowledging, honestly, what it would actually mean to insert a rational person into Springfield's world. The show was always asking you to accept Homer's immunity from consequence. Frank Grimes refused that acceptance, and his refusal was fatal, not as punishment but as inevitability. The world of Springfield cannot sustain someone who sees it clearly. The Halloween specials, the Treehouse of Horror episodes, operated under a different set of standards than the regular episodes, and were the site of some of the show's most explicit content. These episodes are explicitly non-canonical, which gives the writers more freedom to depict violence and darkness than the regular episodes permit. Fox was generally more permissive with the Halloween specials than with the main run, understanding that viewers accepted a different set of expectations for the annual horror anthology. But even within this more permissive space, certain segments generated concern. One Treehouse of Horror segment depicting graphic violence against the Simpson family was edited for broadcast in certain markets. Another segment was flagged internally before it aired and went through several rounds of revision to find a balance between the horror comedy premise and the limits of what was acceptable in a primetime time slot. The process of finding that balance was itself a kind of ongoing negotiation about where the show's limits were, a negotiation that never fully resolved because the limits kept moving and the show kept testing them. The episode Bart the Mother generated relatively little public controversy, but a significant internal discussion about content. The episode involves Bart accidentally killing a mother bird and then taking on the responsibility of caring for her eggs, which hatch into animals that are not the birds he expected. The episode's quiet emotional core, Bart's guilt, and his eventual finding of a kind of redemption through responsibility, was genuinely moving. But certain animal rights organizations had concerns about how the hunting depicted in the episode was handled, and the production team spent time addressing those concerns before the episode aired. The history of The Simpsons pulled and protested episodes is not a history of a show that was reckless with its power to offend. The episodes that generated the most controversy were almost always the ones that touched most directly on things that genuinely mattered: grief, representation, violence, faith, cultural dignity. The show's willingness to engage with these things, rather than avoiding them in favor of safer comic territory, was both the source of its significance and the source of its controversies. What all of the pulled and protested episodes share beneath their surface differences is that they touched real things. The gun episode touched real anxiety about firearms in American life. The China episode touched real sensitivity about how a major power was represented in Western entertainment. The New York episode became entangled with real grief. The Brazil episode engaged with real questions about how nations are depicted in foreign media. The Frank Grimes episode probed real questions about the show's relationship to its own premise. Real contact is what made these episodes uncomfortable. And real contact is what made The Simpsons, across its entire run, something more than entertainment. You do not pull episodes, or generate diplomatic incidents, or organize national pressure campaigns against content that is not making genuine contact with things that matter. The controversy in every case was evidence of the show doing exactly what the show was meant to do. Section 7. The Apu Problem. Representation, accountability, and a character the show could not save. There are very few moments in the history of American television when a documentary film about a single character in a long-running animated series became a genuine cultural event. The Problem with Apu, a documentary made by comedian Hari Kondabolu and released in 2017, was that rare thing. It did not just start a conversation, it forced a reckoning that the show's creative team was, by most evidence, genuinely unprepared for. Apu Nahasapima Petilon had been a fixture of The Simpsons since the show's early seasons. He was the proprietor of the Quick E-Mart convenience store, one of the show's most frequently visited locations, and one of its most productive sources of recurring comedy. He was hardworking, deeply devoted to his family, fiercely proud of his culture, and voiced by Hank Azaria in an accent that Kondabolu's documentary and many Indian American viewers described as one of the most damaging and pervasive caricatures of South Asian identity in American popular culture. The documentary's power came from the specific testimony it gathered. Kondabolu interviewed a series of successful Indian American actors, comedians, and cultural figures, asking them about their personal experience with Apu, with the voice, with the character's role in shaping how non-Indian Americans perceived and interacted with people who looked and sounded like them. The stories were consistent in a way that was difficult to dismiss. Person after person described being imitated in the Apu voice by classmates, by strangers, by people who meant it as a joke and did not understand why it landed as something else entirely. Person after person described watching Apu and feeling a complicated mixture of recognition and shame, seeing a version of their community rendered in a form they had not chosen and could not escape. The documentary's argument was not that Apu was a villain or that The Simpsons was a racist show. Kondabolu was explicit that his relationship with the show was deeply affectionate, that he had grown up watching it, that he considered many aspects of it brilliant. The problem with Apu, as the documentary framed it, was not that his character existed, but that a single, broadly drawn caricature had become the primary representation of South Asian identity in American popular culture for an entire generation. And that the accent at the center of that characterization was not a loving portrait of a real community's speech patterns, but a broad performance that encoded a set of assumptions about foreignness and difference. The history of how Apu came to be is relevant context here. In the show's earliest seasons, the Quick E-Mart needed a proprietor, and the character of Apu was developed as a recurring background figure who happened to work at a place the Simpson family visited frequently. The character was written with more depth than many of the show's background figures, given a backstory, an academic history, a family, a set of values and opinions. These elements reflected genuine creative attention to Apu as a character rather than as a caricature. But the voice. The voice was the problem from the beginning, in a way that the show's creative team either did not recognize at the time or recognized and decided was an acceptable trade-off for the comedy the performance generated. Hank Azaria, a gifted actor with an extraordinary range of voices, had developed the Apu accent as a performance choice, drawing on various influences to create something that was funny and distinctive and that became inextricably associated with the character. The accent was not meant as cruelty, it was meant as a comedic performance. But its effect on Indian American viewers, particularly younger ones who grew up hearing it replicated as mockery, was something that the people who created it did not fully reckon with at the time. Understanding the harm that the accent caused requires understanding the specific cultural context in which it operated. Indian American immigration to the United States had created a significant community of South Asian families whose children were growing up in American schools, encountering American culture, and navigating the complicated social terrain of being visibly different in a country that was still learning how to see them. For many of these children, Apu was the most prominent South Asian figure in the mainstream media they consumed. And the specific way Apu was presented, the exaggerated accent, the comic subservience, the gentle mockery of his foreignness became the lens through which their non-Indian classmates sometimes chose to see them. This is not an abstract harm. The people in Kondabolu's documentary were not theorizing about potential negative effects. They were describing specific experiences, specific moments in their own lives, when the Apu voice was used against them. Specific ways in which the character had shaped how they were perceived and treated by people who knew them from real life but understood South Asian identity primarily through a cartoon. The response from The Simpsons was, by most assessments, unfortunate. In the April 2018 episode No Good Read Goes Unpunished, Lisa Simpson was shown reading a book that the show had previously adapted for an episode, a book that had aged badly in terms of its representation of certain characters. Marge asked what could be done about it. Lisa turned and looked directly into the camera in a moment of explicit meta-commentary and said that she did not have a perfect answer, that some things from the past were simply problematic and it was hard to talk about. On the table in front of her was a framed photograph of Apu. The message seemed to be that the show was aware of the controversy but was declining to resolve it, treating the criticism as an example of the broader phenomenon of older cultural products being judged by contemporary standards and finding the question too complicated to answer. Many viewers, including Kondabolu himself, found this response dismissive, a way of declining accountability by gesturing at complexity. Kondabolu's response was itself measured and disappointed, rather than angry. He described the episode's approach as a cop-out, noting that the show had treated a genuine concern about real harm done to real people as an abstract philosophical puzzle rather than as something that required a substantive creative response. He was not asking the show to erase Apu. He was asking the show to engage seriously with what the character's history meant. What the show might have done, and what some critics argued it should have done, was engage with the character's history directly. An episode that acknowledged the harm the Apu accent had caused, that gave the character a chance to be seen as something more than a caricature, that demonstrated the show's capacity for genuine self-reflection rather than defensive meta-commentary, would have been hard to write. It might not have fully satisfied anyone, but it would have been a more honest engagement with a real problem than the approach the show took. The show had, after all, produced episodes that engaged seriously with controversial subjects and found ways to acknowledge complexity without abandoning the show's essential identity as comedy. The episode Homer's Enemy had probed uncomfortable questions about the show's own premise. Multiple episodes had addressed Homer's relationship with his mother and the genuine harm that relationship had involved. The capacity for genuine emotional engagement with difficult subjects was present. The will to apply it to the Apu question seems not to have been. The Apu situation evolved further over the following seasons in ways that tracked roughly with the show's general discomfort with the whole subject. Apu's appearances became less frequent. His accent, already present in fewer scenes, became less prominent. The show seemed to be attempting to address the problem by reducing Apu's visibility rather than by reconceiving his portrayal. This approach satisfied neither critics who wanted a genuine reckoning nor fans who had affection for the character and felt he was being quietly erased rather than thoughtfully reconsidered. In 2020, Hank Azaria announced that he would no longer voice the character of Apu. The announcement was made without a corresponding announcement about who would voice the character going forward or what direction the character would take. Azaria's statement was substantive and genuine. He described having had conversations with members of the Indian American community, specific conversations with specific people, and said that those conversations had given him a more concrete understanding of the harm the character had caused. He did not frame his decision as capitulation to pressure. He framed it as a considered response to information he had received and to a moral responsibility he had come to recognize. The contrast between Azaria's response and the show's institutional response is instructive. Azaria, as an individual, engaged with the criticism seriously, sought out the people most affected by it, and arrived at a personal conclusion that required him to give up something he had done for 30 years. The show, as an institution, generated a meta-commentary episode that acknowledged the controversy without engaging with it substantively. One of these responses looks like genuine accountability. The other looks like Wanyi institutional self-preservation. The Apu controversy opened up a broader conversation about the show's overall approach to representation, a conversation that had been happening in various forms for years, but that the documentary brought into sharp focus. The show had for most of its run used white actors to voice characters of various ethnicities and backgrounds. Apu was the most prominent example, but not the only one. Azaria also voiced Dr. Nick Riviera and various other non-white characters. Carl Carlson, one of Homer's co-workers, was voiced by a white actor for many seasons before the role was recast with a black actor. The show's approach to casting had reflected the norms of the industry at the time it was produced, norms that were themselves a legacy of a long history of white actors performing characters of color. The industry-wide conversation about voice casting and animation that intensified around 2020 affected The Simpsons, along with essentially every other long-running animated series. Shows across the board re-examined their casting choices, and in many cases changed them, with white actors stepping away from roles they had originated, and those roles being recast with actors whose backgrounds matched their characters. The Simpsons participated in this process, though the changes attracted particular attention, given the scale and duration of the show's history. The Apu story is ultimately a story about the limits of institutional self-awareness, and about the specific difficulty of a creative enterprise reckoning with harm it caused without intending to. The Simpsons is a show made by people who are extraordinarily good at identifying and satirizing the self-deceptions of others. It is harder to apply that same scrutiny to yourself, particularly when the thing being scrutinized is something you built with genuine love and from which you derive genuine pride. The show saw the problem with Apu in the end, clearly enough to stop voicing the character in the original way. But it saw it slowly and reluctantly, and the journey toward that recognition was not its finest creative hour. The legacy of the Apu controversy within the broader history of the show's scandals is specific and important. It demonstrated that longevity does not exempt a creative work from accountability, that a show can be genuinely excellent in many respects, while also having caused genuine harm in others, and that the response to being shown that harm matters almost as much as the harm itself. The Simpsons had an opportunity to respond to the Apu criticism in a way that demonstrated its capacity for honest self-examination, and it mostly chose not to. That choice is part of the show's record now, alongside everything else. Section 8. Guest stars, grudges, and departures. The celebrities who came and the ones who never came back. The Simpsons has hosted more celebrity guest appearances than any other scripted television series in history. By the time the show passed its 30th season, the list of people who had appeared as themselves or as characters in the show included multiple presidents and former presidents, Nobel Prize winners, rock legends, classical musicians, Hollywood icons, sports heroes, and at least one person who guest starred, and then became genuinely famous afterward in a sequence that suggested the show had better casting instincts than most talent agencies. The guest star format that The Simpsons developed, particularly in its early and middle seasons, was genuinely original. The show did not simply book celebrities to play themselves in order to generate publicity. It typically created specific story reasons for celebrities to appear, gave them material that was funny in ways that related to their actual public persona, and in the best cases gave them a chance to demonstrate comedic self-awareness that the audience had not previously seen from them. The format created some extraordinary moments. When Leonard Nimoy appeared in an early episode, playing himself with a kind of knowing detachment from his Spock identity that was both funny and oddly poignant, it established a template for how the show's celebrity appearances could work at their best. The guest was not there to be flattered, they were there to participate in a joke, and the joke was often partly at their expense. And their willingness to be part of that joke was itself the source of the comedy. The episode that really established the template in its fullest form was the one that brought Johnny Carson to Springfield, an appearance that was discussed within the industry as a landmark booking. Carson was famously private and famously selective about his appearances on other people's programs. The fact that he agreed to do The Simpsons was itself a statement about what the show had become culturally and his performance, which involved him playing himself with a quality of self-awareness that his Tonight Show persona had never quite revealed, became one of the most discussed guest spots in the show's early run. The relationship between the show and its guest stars was not always smooth, however, and the cases where it went wrong are illuminating in their own way. Dustin Hoffman's appearance in Stark Raving Dad, which we will discuss in more detail in the music section, is one of the most famous anonymous credits in television history. Hoffman agreed to appear as the large white man who believed himself to be Michael Jackson, on the condition that his name not be used in the credits. He was credited as John J. Smith. The episode became one of the most beloved of the entire series, and Hoffman's involvement, an open secret for years before it was officially confirmed, added a layer of behind-the-scenes intrigue that gave the episode additional legendary status. The decision-making behind why Hoffman wanted to be anonymous has never been fully explained, though speculation has centered on the possibility that he was uncertain whether voicing a character in a primetime animated series was consistent with the kind of film career he had built. This was 1991, and the landscape of voice acting for film and television stars was not what it would later become. The idea of a major dramatic actor lending his voice to a character in an animated comedy was less normalized than it eventually became, and the anonymity may have been a hedge against the professional implications of the association. In retrospect, the anonymity made the whole thing more interesting. The mystery of who was playing Leon Kompowski was a topic of genuine speculation for years. Various guesses were made and circulated. The eventual confirmation of Hoffman's involvement gave the episode an additional layer of appreciation, a sense that something genuinely significant had been hiding in plain sight. The cases where celebrities declined to return after their initial appearances are largely unrecorded in any systematic way, because the show's producers were generally discreet about the internal dynamics of casting decisions. But some situations were public enough to generate their own narratives. The show's relationship with certain categories of celebrity was complicated by the fact that the guest appearances were, by design, satirical. When a show is going to depict your public persona in a cartoon context, there is always the possibility that the depiction will capture something true about you that you would prefer remained unexamined. The Simpsons was not malicious in its guest star portrayals, but it was perceptive, and perception in comedy tends to find the edges of things. Celebrities who played fictional characters rather than themselves generally had more latitude because the fictional frame removed the question of whether the depiction was accurate. But celebrities who played themselves, which was a significant portion of the guest appearances in the show's middle seasons, were signing up to be seen through the show's particular comic lens. The assumption was that celebrities were adults with enough self-awareness to understand and appreciate the terms of the arrangement. This assumption was not always correct. The process of booking guests for the show was itself an industry unto itself. The show's producers had relationships with talent agencies and publicists across the entertainment industry, and the reputation the show had built for treating its guests well, for giving them genuinely funny material, rather than simply using their fame as a prop, generally made the booking process easier than it would otherwise have been. Word got around in the way that word does in the entertainment industry. Appearing in The Simpsons was a good experience that resulted in something you could be proud of. That reputation was carefully maintained and was itself a significant asset. There were occasional cases where the booking process created awkwardness after the fact. When an episode was written around a specific celebrity's participation, and that celebrity then became controversial for unrelated reasons before the episode aired, the show had to decide whether to pull the episode, recast the role, or air it as planned. These decisions were made case by case, with different calculi applying in different situations. The show's approach to musical guest appearances, separate from its broader celebrity history, created its own set of stories. Rock bands and individual musicians appeared throughout the run, and the show became known for its willingness to give musical guests material that was actually funny rather than simply providing a performance showcase. The contrast with other shows that booked musical guests primarily as ratings draws was stark. When Sting appeared in The Simpsons, the joke was something about Sting. Not just Sting playing a song while the characters watched appreciatively. Paul McCartney's episode produced one of the show's most discussed off-screen demands. McCartney agreed to appear in the show on the condition that Lisa become a vegetarian in the episode and remain one permanently. He wanted the character to sustain a value position, not just visit it for comedic purposes in a single episode before returning to normal. The show agreed, and Lisa has been a vegetarian ever since, which is a genuinely unusual commitment for a show to make to a guest's wishes, and which has shaped hundreds of subsequent episodes in small ways. McCartney's involvement was handled with particular care on the production side. Linda McCartney also appeared in the episode, voicing a character, and the couple's commitment to vegetarianism and animal welfare gave the episode's central narrative genuine emotional grounding, rather than the feel of a celebrity cameo in search of a story. It is one of the cleaner examples of the show successfully integrating a guest appearance into a narrative that felt like it was about something real. The Aerosmith episode generated a different kind of behind-the-scenes story. The band appeared in an episode during Bart's teenage years, and their interactions with Homer produced some of the show's most quoted lines from that period. The backstory of how the booking happened, involving connections through the entertainment industry and a band that was, at that specific moment, in the mid-1990s in one of its periodic creative and commercial revivals, illustrated the show's ability to find the right celebrity at exactly the right moment in their cultural trajectory. The show's relationship with athletes was its own fascinating chapter. Athletes who had agreed to appear sometimes discovered that the show's willingness to be funny about their public personas meant that the episode was not a hagiography. The Simpsons was not going to give any celebrity, athletic or otherwise, an uncritical celebration. If you were going to be in Springfield, you were going to be in a comedy, and comedy requires friction and truth, and occasionally the willingness to let the subject of the joke be the butt of it. The late-season guest appearances, as the show's production moved further into the 21st century, reflected changes in the celebrity landscape. The pop culture figures who would have been obvious choices in 1993 were not the obvious choices in 2013. The show adapted, booking guests from different corners of the entertainment world, from social media celebrities to streaming stars to athletes, competing in sports that had not been culturally central in the show's early years. The quality of these later bookings varied, partly because the show's ability to integrate guest appearances seamlessly into stories had declined along with its general narrative discipline. The accumulation of guest appearances over 36 seasons is itself a kind of cultural history. A list of everyone who appeared in The Simpsons across its entire run would read as a map of American celebrity culture from 1989 to the present, a register of who mattered in the culture at any given moment and in what way. The show's celebrity history is, in this sense, an accidental archive of a specific era of American fame. Alf Clausen, who was the show's primary composer from 1990 to 2017, created a musical vocabulary for Springfield that was itself a remarkable creative achievement, blending the conventions of television comedies, scoring with genuine musical sophistication in ways that supported and enriched the humor on screen without calling attention to itself. Clausen's departure from the show in 2017, after nearly 3 decades as its primary composer, was itself a minor controversy. He was let go without what many considered adequate notice or recognition, replaced by a different composer whose work, while competent, had a distinct character that longtime viewers noticed. The manner of the transition generated sympathy for Clausen within the industry, with many people who had worked on the show describing the handling of his departure as less gracious than his decades of service deserved. He had been a quiet but essential part of what made Springfield sound like Springfield, and his absence was audible to anyone paying attention. The guest star format's legacy in American television is considerable. The Simpsons essentially demonstrated that primetime animation could attract major talent, that celebrities would and should engage with the form seriously, and that a cartoon could be a more interesting venue for certain kinds of self-presentation than a talk show appearance or a magazine profile. The shows that came after, from Family Guy to Archer to BoJack Horseman, inherited a guest star culture that The Simpsons had largely created. The celebrities who came and went through Springfield over the decades are too numerous to catalog in any meaningful way. But the ones who came back, who found in the show a venue they kept returning to, are worth noting as evidence of something genuine. The Simpsons, at its best, gave its guests something they could not get elsewhere: a chance to be seen clearly and found funny for exactly what they were, without flattery, without the usual celebrity machinery, just a cartoon drawing and a microphone and a joke that assumed you were smart enough to be in on it. Section 9. Michael Jackson, Prince, and the Music Controversies. The episode Stark Raving Dad is the most beloved episode of the first 3 seasons of The Simpsons. It is also, as of 2019, one of the least available pieces of content in the show's catalog, removed from streaming platforms and future broadcasts by the show's own producers in response to the allegations against Michael Jackson, detailed in the documentary Leaving Neverland. The arc of this episode, from beloved classic to cultural pariah to complex question mark, tracks almost perfectly the arc of Jackson's reputation in the 21st century. And it raises questions about the show's history that do not have comfortable answers. The episode, which aired in September 1991 as the Season 3 premiere, involved Homer being committed to a mental health facility where he meets a large white man named Leon Kompowski, who sincerely believes himself to be Michael Jackson. The character was voiced by Michael Jackson under the pseudonym John J. Smith. His real participation kept secret for years, though widely suspected and eventually confirmed. The character sang to Bart, helped Homer make peace with Lisa after forgetting her birthday, and provided the episode with an emotional warmth that it would not have had without the specific quality Jackson brought to the performance. To understand why the episode mattered so much, you have to understand what it meant at the time it aired. The Simpsons in September 1991 was at the absolute peak of its cultural moment. The 3rd season premiere was one of the most watched events in animation history. Michael Jackson in 1991 was arguably the most famous human being on Earth. The two things colliding, the show at its peak and the star at the height of his fame, produced an episode that felt genuinely historic. A convergence of two cultural forces that left a mark on an entire generation of viewers. The episode was universally praised. It was cited in top 10 lists of the show's greatest moments. It was the subject of nostalgic affection from millions of viewers who had seen it as children. The reveal of Jackson's involvement, when it was finally officially confirmed, added a layer of behind-the-scenes mythology that made it even more discussed. When Leaving Neverland aired in 2019, presenting detailed accounts from 2 men who alleged Jackson had sexually abused them as children, The Simpsons producers faced a decision that had no clean resolution. The episode they had in the archive was not just a piece of entertainment. It was a piece of entertainment whose special quality was entirely dependent on the participation of a man now accused of horrific crimes against children. Removing it would disappoint viewers who loved it. Keeping it available would mean profiting from and effectively celebrating the work of a person whose victims had come forward with credible and detailed accounts of abuse. The producers made their decision quickly. Executive producer James L. Brooks said the episode was being pulled, that it was the only choice to make. The episode disappeared from streaming platforms and was not included in syndication packages. The show had, in effect, excised a piece of its own history. Not because the episode itself was problematic, but because its existence was inseparable from the participation of someone whose legacy had been fundamentally altered. The decision was not universally applauded. Some argued that the episode should remain available, that art can be separated from artist, that removing it was an erasure of history rather than an accountability measure. Others argued that the decision was not about separating art from artist, but about not actively promoting and profiting from the work of a credibly accused child abuser. The debate was a microcosm of a broader cultural argument that has played out across multiple contexts in the years since. What makes The Simpsons case particularly interesting is that the episode's emotional heart, its warmth, its message about forgiveness and family, was delivered by the specific person who is now accused of the specific crimes that make his presence troubling. The episode is about a grown man helping a child feel loved and understood. In retrospect, that premise acquires a discomfort that was not part of its original reception, and whether that discomfort is sufficient reason to prevent its continued circulation is a question that reasonable people continue to answer differently. The song written for the episode, performed by the Jackson-voiced character for Bart's birthday, is a genuinely beautiful piece of work. It was written specifically for the episode by Jackson and his collaborators, and it functions within the story as a moment of real emotional resolution, a father's friend helping to repair a relationship between siblings. Its removal from the accessible archive has deprived generations of future viewers of a piece of the show's history that is, in purely artistic terms, some of its finest work. That loss is real. It was chosen deliberately. The people who made the choice believed it was right, and the reasoning behind it remains defensible even for people who feel the loss. The show's relationship with music goes well beyond Michael Jackson, of course. Music has been woven into The Simpsons' fabric from the very beginning, in ways both obvious and structural. The show produced several episodes that were essentially musical, including Homer's Barbershop Quartet, which charted the rise and fall of a Beatles-esque group that Homer had been part of before the events of the regular series. The episode was both a loving pastiche of Beatles mythology and a genuinely funny exploration of the vanity and contingency of musical fame. Complete with a Yoko figure and a Hamburg-era backstory that was built with obvious knowledge of and affection for the actual history it was satirizing. The show's relationship with the music industry was generally warm, partly because the show treated music with obvious, genuine love, and partly because appearing in The Simpsons had proven to be good for an artist's cultural currency. The pattern of musicians wanting to appear on the show, rather than needing to be persuaded, made the booking process for music-related episodes relatively easy. Artists understood by the mid-1990s that the show took music seriously and would not use their presence merely as a rating stunt. The episode Homer's Enemy touched on classical music tangentially, and The Simpsons' relationship with classical music was consistently warm in a way that was unusual for American primetime television. Lisa's musical identity was built around jazz and classical influences, rather than around the pop music that dominated the cultural landscape, and the show's treatment of her musicianship was genuinely informed. The episodes that dealt with Lisa's saxophone playing and her relationship to jazz tradition were written by people who understood what jazz was and why it mattered to the people who loved it. The punk rock episode featured actual understanding of punk history. The hip-hop references scattered through various episodes reflected genuine engagement with that music, rather than the superficial borrowing that characterizes most television's approach to popular music. The show treated music, all music, as something worth understanding on its own terms before you started making jokes about it. This respect was both unusual for the form and one of the things that made the musical elements of the show work as well as they did. The situation with Paul Simon and El Condor Pasa in one episode illuminates the show's complicated relationship with musical clearances and rights. Certain songs that the show wanted to use required licensing negotiations that were not always straightforward, and the show occasionally had to find alternatives when a desired piece of music was either unavailable or too expensive to clear. The music budget of the show, which included original composition, orchestral recording, and licensing for existing music, was substantial, and the decisions about where to allocate that budget shaped the show's sonic character in ways that listeners felt even when they were not consciously aware of them. Prince is a more complicated case in the show's musical history. Prince controlled his image and his catalog with an intensity that made many potential collaborations difficult to execute, and the specific terms under which he might have appeared in or approved content involving The Simpsons were never publicly settled in any significant way. The show referenced Prince and his cultural significance across various episodes, but the relationship between the show and the artist was never the direct, documented connection that the Michael Jackson episode represents. After Prince's death in 2016, the question of how to handle his music and his image became a matter for his estate. and the estate's approach to licensing and representation has been significantly more restrictive than the approach of estates handling the legacies of other comparable artists. Prince spent much of his career fighting for control over his own music against record labels and corporations that he felt had exploited him, and the estate's protectiveness may reflect a continuation of that protective instinct. The broader music industry's relationship with The Simpsons has been shaped by the show's actual musical quality as much as by its celebrity appeal. The show employed classically trained musicians for its orchestra. The original songs written for various episodes were composed with genuine musical sophistication. The show was not using music as background color. It was using music as a narrative and comedic tool, and it was doing so at a level that musicians and composers found genuinely interesting. The legacy of Alf Clausen's work on the show, across nearly 3 decades of musical composition, is substantial and underappreciated outside of animation circles. Clausen developed a specific musical language for Springfield that was distinctive enough to be immediately recognizable and flexible enough to support the full emotional range of what the show was doing. His musical humor was as specific and as crafted as the verbal and visual humor of the scripts he was supporting, and the music and the other elements of the show worked together in ways that are audible when you pay attention to them. The Michael Jackson decision, the Prince complications, the Clausen departure, the McCartney vegetarianism demand. These are each pieces of a story about the relationship between music and a show that took music seriously enough to let it matter. The controversies that emerged from that seriousness were the controversies of engagement rather than of avoidance. The Simpsons cared about music enough to let that caring generate friction, and the friction was evidence of genuine contact with something real. Section 10. The writers who left and the ones who stayed too long. The history of The Simpsons, understood through the lens of its writing staff, is the history of 2 different shows that share a title and a set of characters, but operate on fundamentally different creative principles. The first show, which ran roughly from seasons 2 through 8, was the product of a writer's room operating at a level of sustained creative excellence that is genuinely rare in any medium. The second show, which followed from roughly season 9 onward, was produced by a different set of people working in the shadow of what the first show had been. And the question of what that shadow does to a creative enterprise is one of the most interesting questions the show's history raises. The transition was not clean and it was not fast. It happened gradually, through a series of individual departures that each felt like small losses at the time, and that accumulated into a fundamental transformation of the show's creative character. The people who left did not leave because the show stopped being good. Many of them left because other opportunities became available to them, opportunities that would not have existed had the show not been as good as it was, and had not demonstrated their abilities to an industry that was paying attention. Conan O'Brien wrote for The Simpsons before he became a television host. His episodes, particularly Marge versus the Monorail, are among the most celebrated in the show's entire run. Marge versus the Monorail is a specific kind of perfection, the kind that comes from a writer in complete command of a form, finding the exact right joke for the exact right moment, and executing it at the exact right speed. The episode borrowed its structure from The Music Man, the Broadway musical, and used that structure to tell a story about Springfield's susceptibility to a certain kind of confident con, a story that turned out to be genuinely insightful about how communities make decisions and how charisma can substitute for substance. O'Brien left to host Late Night on NBC, a decision that was clearly correct in terms of his career, and his departure from the writing staff removed a specific kind of absurdist intelligence that would be hard to replace. The Monorail episode's particular quality, its willingness to follow a joke to its most extreme conclusion, and then follow it further, is something that characterizes the best O'Brien scripts, and something that became less common after he left. The relationship between the show and Conan was warm publicly, even as it demonstrated the fundamental problem of running a creative institution that succeeds, which is that success generates opportunities for the talent that built the institution, and those opportunities inevitably draw the talent away. The Simpsons was essentially a farm team for American comedy, and its losses to the major leagues were both sources of pride and creative wounds. Greg Daniels wrote for The Simpsons before he went on to develop the American version of The Office and to create Parks and Recreation. His departure represented another specific kind of intelligence leaving the room. a talent for character interiority and emotional grounding that distinguished certain episodes from what could have been pure gag delivery. The best Daniels-associated work shows characters whose humor derives from who they actually are rather than from the situations they are placed in, which is a harder and rarer thing to achieve. The American Office, when it arrived, had that same quality. Characters whose comedy came from the specific truth of who they were rather than from circumstances happening to generic stand-ins. You can see the lineage. John Swartzwelder, whose contribution to the show's golden age we touched on earlier, remained associated with the show longer than many of his contemporaries, eventually writing around 60 episodes across his career. The quality of his work, maintained over that extraordinary span, is a testament to a creative sensibility that was extraordinarily consistent. His scripts had a quality that other writers in the room described with something close to awe. They were funny in ways that seemed effortless, that concealed their construction, that arrived at comedy through paths you could not have mapped in advance. The specific characteristics of a Swartzwelder script are worth describing because they illuminate what was lost when he stopped writing. His jokes tended to be aggressive, forward-leaning things that did not wait for the audience. They trusted the audience to keep up, to make the connections, to arrive at the punchline under their own power, rather than being escorted to it. There was a density to the comedy that required full attention to appreciate, and there was a consistency of tone across his scripts that made them feel like the work of someone who had developed a complete and idiosyncratic relationship with the show's world. Swartzwelder eventually stopped submitting scripts, and his gradual withdrawal from the show over the course of the 2000s represented the loss of a voice that was genuinely irreplaceable. He did not go on to another high-profile career that would explain the departure in conventional terms. He appears to have simply stopped, which is its own kind of statement about what the show had become by that point. The showrunner changes tell their own story. When Mike Rice and Al Jean ran the show during its early peak, the sensibility was one of aggressive absurdism matched with genuine emotional intelligence. When David Merkin took over for seasons 5 and 6, the show became somewhat darker and more satirically aggressive, though the quality remained extraordinary. Merkin's seasons have some of the show's most caustic humor, the jokes with the sharpest edges, the satire that cut deepest. Homer's Triple Bypass, Homer and Apu, Deep Space Homer. These are episodes with a specific flavor that reflects Merkin's particular sensibility. When Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein ran seasons 7 and 8, the show was perhaps at its most formally ambitious, attempting things narratively that animated comedies had not tried before. Their seasons include Who Shot Mr. Burns?, the first genuine cliffhanger in animated television history, and multiple episodes that used genre parody as a structural device in ways that required the audience to be paying sophisticated attention to what was happening. These were seasons that trusted the audience to understand references and to appreciate formal experimentation alongside joke density. When Mike Scully took over for seasons 9 through 12, the consensus among critics and viewers was that something had fundamentally shifted. Scully's tenure is the most contested in the show's showrunner history. He ran the show during the period that many fans identify as the beginning of the quality decline, and the question of whether the decline was his responsibility or simply coincided with his tenure is one that partisans on both sides of the argument have been relitigating for 20 years. What is undeniable is that the show under Scully became more willing to prioritize joke density over story coherence, to let Homer's character drift toward outright cruelty in ways that made him harder to root for, and to depict Springfield as a world where anything could happen rather than a world with consistent internal rules. The Homer of Season 9 could be doing literally any job by the episode's end. The Homer of Season 5 was fundamentally a nuclear safety inspector, with a set of specific relationships and a specific position in the world that gave his adventures their meaning. Removing those constraints removed something important about what made the character work. The people who stayed the longest faced their own kind of challenge, which was to continue producing work in a form they had mastered over years and to find in that mastery something that still felt like discovery. The writers who were still on the show in its 30th season were almost by definition people for whom writing The Simpsons had become a long-term professional commitment rather than a temporary stop on a career trajectory. That commitment produced a different kind of work than the work produced by people who were still early in their career. still hungry, still finding out what they could do. There is a specific kind of creative exhaustion that comes from being exceptionally good at something for a very long time. It is different from ordinary fatigue. It is the exhaustion that comes from having made all of the obvious moves, having found all of the obvious jokes, having told all of the obviously good versions of all of the stories available in your form. What remains after that exhaustion is either the discovery of new territory or the increasingly sophisticated recombination of previously discovered territory. And these two things produce work that feels different, even when it is technically proficient. Al Jean's continued presence as executive producer through the show's entire run is itself a remarkable story. He came to the show in its earliest seasons, helped define what it was, left to develop other projects, and then returned to run the show for an extended period that has now lasted far longer than any other single showrunner's tenure. His relationship with the show is simultaneously that of its institutional steward and its longest-serving active creative voice, and the dual nature of that role has shaped the later seasons in ways that are genuinely complex. Gene has spoken about the challenge of maintaining the show's identity over a period of time so long that it has outlasted multiple changes in what American comedy considers good. The show that was innovative in 1993 was by definition not innovative in 2013, because the things it had pioneered had been absorbed into the broader culture. The challenge for Gene and his team has been to find something true to say in a form that has become, through their own success, thoroughly familiar. The writers who joined the show in its later periods came with different influences and different senses of what the show should be. They had grown up watching the show rather than building it. Their relationship to its legacy was one of reverence and inheritance rather than origination, and that different relationship produced work that felt, to longtime viewers, like a competent tribute to something rather than the thing itself. This is not a criticism of the later writer's abilities. It is a description of the essential difficulty of maintaining creative vitality in a long-running institution when the institution has become its own most significant influence. The writers who left The Simpsons to pursue other opportunities did not, in most cases, cut their ties with the show entirely. They remained part of the informal community of people who had been shaped by the experience of working there, who referenced it in interviews, who returned occasionally to write special episodes. The show's alumni network is one of the most talented collections of comedy writers in television history, and the fact that they carry the show's influence with them into everything they subsequently create means that The Simpsons' impact on American comedy extends far beyond what appears on the screen. The writers who left defined the show by what they did with their freedom after leaving. The writers who stayed defined the show by what they did with the institutional weight of its history. Both groups were working with the legacy of something extraordinary, and the difficulty of living up to that legacy, or even of defining what living up to it would mean, is the essential creative challenge that The Simpsons has been navigating for more than 2 decades. The challenge is real. The fact that the show has continued to navigate it, imperfectly but honestly, is itself a kind of achievement. Section 11. Springfield goes to court. Legal battles, merchandise wars, and the business of being beloved. Television programs do not often become subjects of serious intellectual property litigation. The legal machinery of copyright, trademark, and publicity rights tends to operate in the background of the entertainment industry, visible mainly to lawyers and business affairs departments. But The Simpsons, because of the extraordinary scope of its commercial success and the extraordinary period of time over which that success has compounded, has been involved in legal disputes that illuminate the fundamental tensions in how creative work is owned, protected, and monetized. The most significant recurring legal theme in the show's history involves the question of who owns the characters and what rights the people who created them retain. This is not a uniquely Simpsons problem. It is the central problem of the entertainment industry, playing out in different forms across virtually every successful franchise in film and television. But The Simpsons' version of this problem has specific features that make it worth understanding in its own terms. Matt Groening's relationship with the Fox Corporation over the intellectual property question has been complicated almost from the beginning. Groening created the characters and the world of Springfield, but he did so under a deal that gave Fox substantial control over the franchise's commercial exploitation. The merchandise empire that grew up around The Simpsons in the early 1990s generated revenues that dwarfed the show's production budget. And the structure of that empire was such that the people who had created it were not its primary beneficiaries. This basic disparity drove repeated attempts by Groening and other key creative personnel to renegotiate their relationship with the franchise's commercial dimensions. The negotiations were not always conducted in public, and the outcomes were not always disclosed. What is known is that the arrangements changed multiple times over the show's history, with Groening securing increasingly favorable terms as his leverage, demonstrated by the show's continuing success, increased. The early merchandise deals that Fox had structured were, from the creator's perspective, deeply unfair, but they were not unusual for the industry at the time. The entertainment industry in the late 1980s operated under a set of standard practices regarding intellectual property and licensing that systematically favored studios and networks over creators. The argument that would eventually become prominent that creators should share meaningfully in the downstream commercial value of their creative work was not yet the industry standard. Groening and his collaborators were not treated worse than other creators in comparable situations. They were treated the way creators were treated, which was not well. The Simpsons merchandise empire itself became a source of litigation from outside the franchise as well as within it. The show's characters, being among the most recognizable images in the world, attracted an extraordinary volume of unauthorized merchandise. T-shirts, stickers, pins, and countless other items bearing Simpsons imagery without Fox's authorization flooded informal markets in the early 1990s, and the legal response was extensive. Fox pursued unauthorized merchandisers aggressively, in part because the scale of the infringement was genuinely large, and in part because the visibility of the Simpsons brand made allowing casual infringement impossible from a trademark maintenance standpoint. The scale of the enforcement effort was itself remarkable. Fox maintained a team dedicated specifically to identifying and pursuing unauthorized Simpsons merchandise, and the team operated across international jurisdictions where the complexities of local intellectual property law created additional challenges. In some countries, the Simpsons trademark was not registered early enough to prevent local producers from establishing competing claims. In others, the cost of enforcement exceeded the potential recovery, and the decision had to be made about which battles were worth fighting. The unauthorized merchandise was not all crude piracy. Some of it was remarkably good, and some of the most interesting came with political or satirical commentary attached. Bart Simpson, in the early 1990s, became a canvas for a particular kind of countercultural expression, with unauthorized T-shirts depicting him making statements or engaging in activities that the Fox licensors had not and would not have approved. These shirts circulated widely, particularly among younger audiences, and they contributed to Bart's cultural identity in ways that the official merchandise did not entirely capture. One particularly famous category of unauthorized Simpsons merchandise depicted Bart in ways that incorporated black cultural imagery, presenting him as a black character and using him to make statements about race and identity that the official show was not making. These shirts were controversial in their own right, debated within black communities about whether they were empowering appropriations of the character or something more complicated. They became artifacts of a specific cultural moment and are now collected as pieces of cultural history. The legal battles over unauthorized shirts were, in many cases, fought and won by Fox, with the manufacturers paying settlements and ceasing production. But the shirts had already done their cultural work by the time the legal system caught up with them. The version of Bart Simpson that lived in the cultural imagination was partly the product of these unauthorized expressions, which had taken the character and given him dimensions that the licensed merchandise had specifically avoided. The show has also been involved in disputes with other creative works that were accused of infringing on its intellectual property. A long-running animated series occupies a large amount of cultural space, and the question of where homage ends and infringement begins is genuinely difficult in creative contexts. Various animated projects over the years have been accused of borrowing too heavily from The Simpsons, in terms of character design, story structure, or comedic approach, and the show's producers have occasionally pursued these accusations through formal legal channels. The relationship between The Simpsons and the animated shows that followed it is complicated by the fact that the show essentially created a genre, and that all subsequent entrants into that genre were inevitably working in its shadow. Some level of influence and resemblance was inevitable. The legal question of when resemblance becomes infringement is not one that copyright law answers cleanly, and the judgments in cases like these have tended to reflect the specific circumstances rather than establishing clear general principles. The Springfield trademark itself has an interesting history. There are dozens of actual Springfields across the United States, and the show's deliberate policy of maintaining geographic ambiguity about where Springfield is located was motivated partly by creative reasons, but also had practical implications for how the franchise's intellectual property could be leveraged commercially. You cannot own a trademark for a place name that describes real places, and the show's fictional Springfield had to be carefully distinguished from the real ones. When the Simpsons experience at Universal Studios theme parks was developed, the legal and commercial architecture required to build a physical manifestation of Springfield was significantly more complex than developing a theme park area around most fictional properties. The development required careful navigation of the various rights and licenses that governed different aspects of the franchise, and the result was a negotiated version of Springfield that represented a particular kind of compromise between creative fidelity and commercial practicality. The theme park version of Springfield is a fascinating artifact in its own right. It is simultaneously a tribute to the show and a commercial product that operates under constraints the show itself does not face. The limitations of physical space, the requirements of safety regulations, the need to accommodate large crowds and generate consistent revenue. These factors shape a theme park experience in ways that a television show is not shaped, and the result is a Springfield that captures certain elements of the original while inevitably being a different kind of thing. The streaming era created new legal and commercial complications. When Disney acquired Fox in 2019, the Simpsons franchise became part of the Disney empire, which created interesting overlaps and potential conflicts with other Disney properties. The show had made jokes about Disney for years, ranging from gentle to pointed, and the new ownership relationship required some recalibration of that relationship. The show has continued to make Disney jokes since the acquisition, which suggests that the new corporate parent understood that restricting the show's ability to satirize its owner would undermine the show's fundamental identity. The Disney Plus launch brought the show's catalog to a new streaming platform, and the aspect ratio controversy that followed, in which the early episodes were cropped to widescreen and visual jokes were cut off, resulted in a legal and commercial situation where the platform was technically providing access to the show's content while actually providing a degraded version of it. The resolution, making the original aspect ratio available as an option, required technical and licensing work that illustrated how even a simple act of making a show available on a streaming platform involves complex negotiations about what version of the show is being made available. What the legal history of The Simpsons ultimately reveals is the essential tension at the heart of all commercial creative work, between the creative impulse that generates the value and the commercial apparatus that captures and distributes it. The show is, at its core, the product of extraordinary creative talent applied to specific human questions about family, community, and what kind of people we are. The legal and commercial machinery that surrounds it is the product of an industry devoted to maximizing the financial return on creative work. These two things coexist uneasily, and the legal history is a record of the ongoing negotiation between them. The negotiation never fully resolves because the interests of creators and corporations are not ultimately aligned, and the tools of contract and intellectual property law are not designed to produce genuine alignment. They are designed to manage conflict, to establish terms under which the conflict can be conducted without destroying the underlying enterprise. The Simpsons has been conducting that conflict for 36 years, and the enterprise has survived. Whether it has survived intact is a question that different people continue to answer differently. Section 12. The Decline That Wasn't. Zombie Simpsons, Legacy, and What It Means to Last. The phrase Zombie Simpsons was coined by a blogger named David Sims in a 2010 essay, and it became one of the most influential pieces of television criticism produced in the early social media era. Not because it said anything particularly new, but because it gave a name to a feeling that millions of viewers already had and had struggled to articulate. The argument was simple. The Simpsons had died creatively around season 9, and what continued afterward was not really The Simpsons at all, but a kind of walking simulacrum, wearing the faces and voices of characters people love, while producing something fundamentally different from what had made those characters worth loving. The essay and its central metaphor spread widely and shaped how a generation of television critics wrote about the show. Zombie Simpsons became shorthand for a type of creative decline, applicable not just to this show but to any long-running series that continued past its natural end. The phrase entered the television commentary vocabulary in a way that still shapes how the show is discussed today, even among people who have never read the original essay. The argument has real merit. The show in its late seasons is genuinely different from the show in its peak seasons, in ways that matter creatively. The emotional architecture is different. The approach to character consistency is different. The tolerance for absurdity has expanded in ways that have untethered certain episodes from the kind of internal logic that made the earlier work feel grounded, despite its satirical exaggeration. The Homer Simpson of Season 25 is a different comedic construction than the Homer Simpson of Season 5, and not all of the differences are improvements. But the Zombie Simpsons argument, applied as literally and as broadly as its proponents often do, misses something important about what the show is and what it has accomplished. It assumes that the early seasons represent the only legitimate version of The Simpsons, and that all subsequent seasons represent a failure to maintain that standard. This assumption is both understandable and somewhat unfair. The show's later seasons have produced individual episodes that match the quality of anything in the classic era, not consistently, and not in clusters that sustain a whole season's worth of excellence, but in individual instances, and the standard against which those instances are measured is itself extraordinary, the product of a writer's room that operated at a level of sustained creative excellence that is genuinely unusual in the history of any medium. Holding every subsequent episode to that standard is like evaluating every jazz performance against the recordings Miles Davis made between 1955 and 1965. The comparison is not wrong to make, but it produces conclusions that may be less useful than they seem. The show's cultural significance has not declined in proportion to its perceived creative decline. If anything, the show's cultural footprint has expanded in the streaming era, as younger viewers discovered the back catalog and as algorithms began surfacing classic episodes to people who had not seen them in years. The Simpsons on Disney Plus became a genuinely significant streaming catalog, drawing viewers who knew the show primarily as a cultural reference point, rather than as something they had watched in first run. The streaming presentation of the early seasons created its own minor controversy. When Disney Plus launched and began streaming the show's archive, it did so in a widescreen format that had not been used for the early episodes. The original seasons were shot in a 4:3 aspect ratio, meaning that the image fills a square-ish screen rather than a widescreen rectangle. When Disney Plus cropped these episodes to a widescreen format, it cut off portions of the image that contained jokes. Visual gags in the original episodes were sometimes placed at the edges of the frame, precisely because the writers and directors knew the full image would be visible, and that surprises could be hidden at the edges. Cropping to widescreen eliminated these visual jokes, replacing them with nothing and leaving viewers of these supposedly restored episodes seeing less of the show than the original audience had. The response from fans was immediate and substantial. The visual jokes that had been removed were cataloged and shared online. The criticism was specific and technically accurate, which made it harder to dismiss. Disney Plus eventually made the original aspect ratio versions available as an option, though the process of getting there demonstrated how the show's commercial stewardship could, even unintentionally, damage the work it was supposed to be presenting. The show's relationship with its own legacy became increasingly self-aware in the later seasons, and this self-awareness is itself one of the most interesting things about the show's later output. The Simpsons has made jokes about its own decline. It has acknowledged, in various ways, that it has been on the air far longer than seems reasonable, and that the audience has complex feelings about its continued existence. Whether this self-awareness constitutes genuine artistic maturity or is simply an elaborate defense mechanism against criticism is a question that the show has never definitively answered. Possibly it is both. The couch gags, which open every episode of the show with a brief animated sequence in which the family races to their couch in increasingly elaborate ways, became in the later seasons an opportunity for genuine creative experimentation that occasionally exceeded anything in the episode that followed. Directors like Sylvain Chomet and Don Hertzfeldt were given creative control over couch gags that became genuinely surprising pieces of short animation, completely unlike anything in the show's standard visual vocabulary. These couch gags, some of which became more widely shared and discussed than the episodes they introduced, suggested that the creative energy for genuine experiment was still available within the show's framework, even when the episodes themselves were more formulaic. The Hertzfeldt couch gag deserves particular mention. It depicted a distorted future version of the show, with corrupted animation and a disturbing vision of what infinite extension might look like for characters trapped in a franchise that will not let them end. It was, paradoxically, the most creatively interesting piece of Simpsons content in years, produced by someone who came from outside the show's production apparatus and brought fresh eyes to the question of what the show was and what it would become. The gag was both a tribute to the show and a mild horror story about what continuity without end looks like. The question of when The Simpsons should end has been a subject of public discussion for more than 2 decades, and the show has continued through every discussion of its end without actually ending. The economic logic of continuation is powerful and not easily dismissed. The show generates significant revenue in syndication, in streaming, in merchandise, and in international licensing, and all of that revenue would stop or diminish significantly if the show stopped producing new episodes. Fox has extended the show's run multiple times, always with commitments that seemed like they might be final and that turned out not to be. The show's creative team has given various answers to the question of when it should end. Al Jean has said multiple times that the show will end when Fox decides it should end, framing the decision as ultimately a commercial one rather than a creative one. Gruening has been somewhat more philosophical about the question, suggesting that the show will end when the right ending presents itself, though what that ending might look like has never been clearly articulated. The show has imagined its ending multiple times in specific episodes, depicting possible future Springfields and possible final moments for the family. But none of these have been presented as the actual ending, all of them occurring within the comfortable frame of the flash-forward or the hypothetical. The legacy of The Simpsons extends so far beyond the question of whether its recent seasons are as good as its early seasons that the decline debate, for all its importance within the show's fan community, represents only a fraction of what the show means culturally. The show changed what animated television could be. It demonstrated that a cartoon could do what serious dramatic television did, could care about its characters in ways that generated genuine emotion, could engage with questions of real social and political significance without sacrificing its identity as comedy. Everything that has followed in the genre, from King of the Hill to Archer to BoJack Horseman to Rick and Morty to the entire landscape of adult animated comedy, exists in the space that The Simpsons opened. Not all of these shows sound like The Simpsons, not all of them are trying to be The Simpsons, but they are all doing something that was not possible before The Simpsons demonstrated that it was possible, and the freedom they operate in is, at least in part, a freedom that this show won for them. The show's influence on comedy writing extends beyond animation. The specific kind of intelligence that The Simpsons represented, the combination of satirical precision and genuine emotional investment, the willingness to be funny in ways that required the audience to be paying full attention, the refusal to condescend, became a model that shaped how a generation of comedy writers thought about their work. You can trace the influence in shows that bear no visual resemblance to The Simpsons, and that operate in completely different genres. The sensibility traveled, it got into the water. The show's influence on American political comedy is particularly significant. The Simpsons did not invent satirical commentary on American institutions, but it demonstrated that such commentary could be funny enough and popular enough to sustain a major commercial franchise. This demonstration gave permission to a generation of political comedians and satirists who followed, making the case that smart was not the enemy of broad, that a joke that required understanding something real could still reach millions of people. The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, last week. Tonight, none of these are The Simpsons, but all of them are doing something that The Simpsons made seem possible and commercially viable. And then there is the audience. The people who grew up watching The Simpsons carry it with them in ways that are not fully captured by ratings or subscriber counts. The show's vocabulary has entered the language. Its specific references have become shorthand for experiences and situations that did not have names before. The moment when something catastrophically backfires is a Homer Simpson moment, understood across generational lines. The moment when someone performs exaggerated politeness while internally seething is a Ned Flanders moment. The phrase, "this is the worst thing I have ever seen," is funnier if you say it in the comic book guy voice, even to people who have not watched the show in years. These are not metaphors that need explaining. They are part of the shared vocabulary of a culture that the show helped shape. The controversy debate, the decline debate, the legacy debate, all of it circles around the same essential question, which is what it means for something to last. The Simpsons has lasted longer than any previous example of its form, and in lasting, it has experienced everything that lasting involves. It has been excellent and mediocre. It has been bold and cautious. It has made decisions it stands behind and decisions it has tried to quietly undo. It has been beloved and resented, and both at the same time by the same people. What it has never been, not once in 36 seasons, is irrelevant. Even its critics, even the people who write at length about why the show has declined, or betrayed its own standards or failed to reckon honestly with its history, are spending their time and energy on it because it still matters. A show that genuinely stopped being The Simpsons would stop generating this much discussion. The zombie Simpsons argument, taken to its logical conclusion, is evidence that the show is still alive. You do not have arguments about zombies. You just stop paying attention to them. The Simpsons will end. It will end when the economics no longer support it, or when the creative talent sustaining it decides collectively that it is time. When it ends, it will have produced somewhere between 800 and 1,000 episodes across multiple decades of American life. It will have been funny and serious and brave and cowardly and irreverent and sentimental and wrong and right, sometimes in the same episode, sometimes in the same scene. It will have changed things in ways that cannot be fully measured, because the changed things are now just what everything is. And somewhere in the archive, across those hundreds of episodes, there will be the specific, perfect joke that landed at exactly the right moment in exactly the right person's living room, and that person will carry it with them for the rest of their life. That is what it means to last. Not the ratings, not the contracts, not the controversies or the legal battles or the representation debates. The specific, perfect joke. The one that made you feel, at the age when you first saw it, that someone understood something true about the world and chose to make it funny rather than making it grim. The show began in controversy and has spent 36 years in one form of controversy or another. It has been protested by presidents and school boards and religious organizations and civil rights advocates and fan communities and music industry estates and foreign governments and its own cast members and its own creators. It has made enemies and friends and occasionally the same person both in the same week. And it is still on. The couch is still there. The opening sequence is still playing. Homer is still looking up at the lights on his way to the seat where he has been sitting for longer than seems possible. And the audience is still showing up, smaller than it was, more divided in its feelings than it was, but present. Still paying attention, still arguing about it. That is the whole story. That is the scandal and the legacy and the miracle. A show that should have ended and did not, that outlasted everyone's expectations, including its own creators, that became something bigger than the medium it existed in and then kept going anyway. The Simpsons is not the best thing television has ever produced. It is the most television thing television has ever produced. The show that pushed the medium to its limit and then kept pushing. Springfield is still there. The power plant is still leaking. Homer is still going to work. And somewhere in the show's archive, preserved in pixels and magnetic tape and digital files on servers all over the world, is the version of this family that existed before any of the controversy, before the lawsuits and the pay disputes, and the representation reckonings and the prediction memes and the zombie debates. The version that existed when Gruning drew them on a napkin in a waiting room and a network executive looked at the drawing and said, "Let's see where this goes. 36 years, 800 episodes, no end in sight." That is where it went. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If you made it this far, you know more about this show's scandals and controversies than most people alive. Drop a comment, subscribe if you want more, and rest well. Section 13, The Simpsons Movie. How a decade of false starts led to Springfield's biggest scandal. By the time The Simpsons movie finally arrived in theaters in July 2007, it had been in development, in one form or another, for nearly 15 years. The story of how the film came to be is a story about institutional dysfunction, creative paralysis, contract disputes, near collapses, and the fundamental difficulty of translating something that worked perfectly in a 22-minute weekly format into something that could justify 2 hours in a cinema. The idea of a Simpsons movie had been discussed almost from the beginning of the show's run. As the series became one of the most successful franchises in entertainment history, the question of whether to extend it into film was obvious, and the financial potential of a theatrical release was staggering. The show's creators had various ideas over the years for what a Simpsons movie might be. Some were grander in conception than others. None of them came together quickly. Part of the difficulty was conceptual. The Simpsons, in its television format, operated according to a specific set of rules about consequence and continuity. Characters did not age. Major events were forgotten by the next episode. The show could put Homer in space, or have the family travel to Australia, or depict the destruction of Springfield. And by the following week, everything would be back to normal. This reset mechanism was essential to how the show worked as a weekly comedy, but it was antithetical to the demands of a film narrative, which requires consequences to accumulate and stakes to be maintained across the full running time. A Simpsons movie had to be about something in a way that a Simpsons episode did not have to be about something. Episodes could be great without having a thesis. They could work as pure comedy, as satire, as emotional portraits of specific moments in the characters' lives, without building toward any kind of conclusion that felt final or significant. A movie needed to feel like it mattered in a different way. And the problem was that the show had deliberately designed itself to never matter in that way, to always return to baseline, to always leave the world intact. The solution that the film eventually arrived at was the dome. The idea of Springfield being enclosed under a glass dome by the federal government as a response to Homer's catastrophic pollution of the lake gave the film both its central conflict and a visual spectacle that the television format could not provide. It also gave the story a way to isolate Springfield from the rest of the world, to make the film's events feel genuinely exceptional while remaining consistent with the show's established universe. The writing of the film was, by most accounts, an extremely difficult process. Multiple writers worked on the script over multiple years, with various drafts going through extensive revision. The final film carries 7 screenwriter credits, which is itself an indication of the collaborative and somewhat chaotic development process. The writers included many of the show's most experienced veterans, but the challenge of making a feature-length Simpsons story work was genuinely difficult in ways that their extensive experience with the format did not fully prepare them for. The film's production created its own conflicts, primarily around the question of what the film would be allowed to do that the television show could not. One of the film's primary selling points, from a marketing perspective, was that it would go further than the television show, would push into territory that the broadcast standards wouldn't permit. The actual degree to which the film pushed those limits was modest by the standards of animated film, including content that was slightly more adult in its visual gags than the show typically delivered, but nothing that could genuinely be described as transgressive. The decision about how much further the film should go than the show was a recurring point of discussion throughout production. Too conservative, and the film would not justify the theatrical experience. Too extreme, and the film would damage the show's brand and alienate the family audience that was a core part of the franchise's commercial base. The calibration of this balance was never fully resolved, and the film that emerged was somewhat cautious in its approach to the freedoms that the theatrical format theoretically permitted. The film was a massive commercial success. It grossed over $500 million worldwide, making it one of the most successful animated films of its era. The critical response was generally positive, with most reviews concluding that it successfully captured the show's essential qualities while delivering the scale and spectacle appropriate for a cinema release. The question of whether it was as good as the show at its peak was largely avoided in the initial reviews, though it became a more prominent conversation in subsequent years. The film's success raised the obvious question of whether a sequel would follow, and the answer to that question has, over the subsequent nearly 2 decades, remained stubbornly unclear. The show's producers have indicated at various points that a second film is in development, or that the possibility is being explored, or that they would like to make one. A sequel has never materialized. The reasons for this non-materialization illuminate something about the specific difficulties of the franchise's situation. The commercial case for a sequel was obvious in 2007, immediately after the film's success. The creative case was harder to make because the film had used the premise that seemed most naturally suited to the theatrical format. Finding a second story that justified the cinema experience without repeating what the first film had done was a genuine creative challenge, and the show's history suggested that when creative challenges were genuinely difficult, the institution tended to defer rather than decide. The film's legacy within the show's broader history is complicated. It arrived during a period when the show's television reputation was at a relatively low ebb, when the zombie Simpsons discourse was already established, and when the critical consensus was that the show had long since passed its peak. The film was received by many viewers as evidence that the show could still do something genuinely good, that the creative capacity for quality had not been entirely lost. Whether that reading was accurate or optimistic is a question that the subsequent television seasons continued to complicate. The film also raised the question of why the theatrical format produced something better than the contemporary television seasons were producing. Part of the answer was probably the concentration of creative talent and effort that a single project could attract, as opposed to the dispersed effort of producing 22 episodes per year. Part was probably the different standards that applied when the work would appear in cinemas, where the audience's expectations and the critical scrutiny were more demanding. And part was probably simply that the writers had 17 years of wanting to make this specific thing, and that accumulated desire produced a quality of attention that the weekly production schedule made difficult to sustain. The Simpsons movie is, in the end, a positive entry in the show's scandal-inflected history, an exception to the patterns that the other controversies in this survey have described. Where most of the show's significant moments involved conflict, the film was a case of the show, against considerable odds and after an improbable development process, simply succeeding at a difficult thing. In a franchise history characterized by so much that went wrong, that matters. Section 14. The show that talked about itself. Meta-commentary, deconstruction, and The Simpsons' war on its own legacy. Every creative work that runs long enough eventually has to decide what to do with its own past. For most television shows, this means clip episodes, anniversary specials, and the occasional moment of self-congratulation. For The Simpsons, which has always been more interested in honesty than in self-congratulation, it meant something considerably stranger. A decades-long running commentary on the show's own existence, quality, decline, and significance, embedded within the show itself. The meta-commentary began early and never stopped. From almost the first season, the show was winking at its audience about the artificiality of what it was doing. The couch gag, which began as a simple visual joke about the family rushing to sit down for television, evolved across hundreds of variations into an ongoing meditation on what it means to have the same opening sequence for 3 decades, what it means to be a cultural institution that keeps arriving in living rooms demanding attention, what it means to be a cartoon family that cannot die or grow old or escape the loop of their own weekly repetition. The show's willingness to acknowledge its own decline is genuinely unusual in the history of long-running entertainment. Most shows that outlast their peak quality either ignore the decline or insist it has not occurred. The Simpsons has made numerous explicit jokes about its own later seasons being less good than its earlier ones, about the audience's complex feelings about the show's continued existence, about the specific ways in which the institution has calcified. These jokes are interesting because they come from inside the machine that is being critiqued. The writers making jokes about the show's decline are the writers who are declining to decline it. The tension this creates is productive rather than paralyzing, at least some of the time. A show that knows it has stayed too long and says so in a funny way is doing something different from a show that stayed too long and doesn't know it. The self-awareness doesn't undo the overstay, but it adds a layer to the experience that transforms it from pure disappointment into something more complicated. A comedy about endurance, about what institutions do to creative work, about the relationship between love and the inability to let go. The Behind the Laughter episode, which aired in 2000 as a mockumentary about the Simpson family as real people who happened to be the subject of a television show, was one of the most formally ambitious pieces of meta-commentary the show attempted. It used the conventions of the music industry documentary format, specifically the VH1 Behind the Music format, to tell the story of the family's rise, their creative peak, their decline, their fracturing, and their eventual reconciliation. The episode acknowledged explicitly that the show had passed its peak, had become formulaic, had lost something essential. And then it resolved with the family back on the couch, ready to do it again. The resolution was both deeply honest and deeply funny. The show was not pretending that the problems it had diagnosed had been solved. It was acknowledging them, and then continuing anyway, which is exactly what institutions do, and which is exactly what the show had been doing for years. The meta-commentary was not a solution to the institutional problems. It was a record of them. The episode featuring the character of Frank Grimes, discussed earlier, operates as a form of meta-commentary that goes deeper than the explicit variety. When Grimes enters Springfield and finds it bewildering, finds Homer's immunity to consequence genuinely disturbing, he is giving voice to a line of criticism that the show had always been generating internally. The show knew what it was. It knew what it was asking the audience to accept. And it knew that a realistic person dropped into its world would find that world not charming, but insane. Grimes is the audience's rational response to the show, dressed up as a character, and his destruction is the show's acknowledgement of what rational engagement with it would produce. The later episodes that specifically reference the show's prediction phenomenon were another form of meta-commentary, using the internet's fascination with the show's supposed prophetic powers as material for comedy that was simultaneously about that fascination and about the show's awareness of its own cultural position. The show had become so culturally embedded that it could make jokes about how people talked about it, and those jokes could be funny to people who had themselves participated in the conversations being mocked. The annual Treehouse of Horror episodes have always operated as a kind of meta-commentary on the show's format, using the explicit non-canonicality of the horror specials as an opportunity to comment on what the canonical episodes could not. Characters have died in Treehouse of Horror episodes. The entire Springfield has been destroyed. Homer has been revealed as a monster of various kinds. The specials gave the writers permission to explore the darkest implications of their characters and their world without having to deal with the consequences, because everyone understood that it was just for Halloween. But some of the most interesting Treehouse moments have used the horror format specifically to comment on the show's own situation. Segments depicting the family being trapped in an eternal loop, being controlled by forces outside their understanding, being unable to escape their designated roles in a system that needs them to keep performing. These are not subtle metaphors. They are pretty direct statements about what it feels like to make the same show for 36 years, and about what it might feel like to be a character in that show. The show's relationship with its fan community has also become a subject of meta-commentary in the later seasons. The internet, which The Simpsons predated and which grew up with the show as a companion, has generated an extraordinary body of commentary, criticism, fan fiction, fan art, and theoretical analysis of the show. The show is aware of this. The show has made jokes about its own fan community, about the intensity of fan engagement with questions of continuity and quality, about the specific ways in which devoted fans relate to creative properties they love. These jokes walk a careful line. They cannot be too contemptuous of the audience because the audience is the constituency without which the show does not exist. But they can be honest about the complexity of the relationship, about the way that deep fandom can become its own kind of trap for fans and for the show alike. The fan who cannot let go of the golden age is having a genuine experience, but that experience is also preventing them from engaging with what the show is currently doing. The show that keeps making references to the golden age is both honoring its own past and acknowledging that it cannot escape it. The meta-commentary era of The Simpsons is, in some respects, the most honest era of the show's history. The comedy of the early seasons was built on a pretense that Springfield was a real place and that the family's problems were real problems. The comedy of the later meta-commentary was built on an acknowledgement that the whole thing was constructed, that the characters were aware of their constructed nature, that the show was aware of its own institutional weight. This is not necessarily more limiting than the earlier approach. It is a different kind of honesty, and occasionally it produces something genuinely remarkable. The show's self-awareness about its own legacy has never resolved into a clean conclusion. The show cannot say definitively what it is now in relation to what it was. It can note the distance, can make jokes about the distance, can do things that are genuinely excellent within the current constraints, and can continue to exist as a thing that generates this much conversation and this much feeling in this many people. That is itself a kind of achievement, even if it is a stranger kind than the achievement of producing great episodes. Section 15. The International Simpsons. How the World Received and Reshaped Springfield. When The Simpsons first aired outside the United States, the people responsible for its international distribution faced a question that had no obvious answer. How do you translate something so specifically and deliberately American into languages and cultural contexts that had different relationships to the values, anxieties, and reference points the show was built on? The answer, it turned out, was that you translated some of it, localized some of it, and left some of it as it was. And the specific mixture of these strategies varied significantly by country, by language, and by the specific cultural relationship that country had with American popular culture. The result was a range of Simpsons experiences around the world that were related to but not identical to the American original. And the differences were themselves revealing documents of how different cultures processed the show's specific brand of American self-criticism. The German dubbing of The Simpsons became one of the most discussed localizations in the show's international history, partly because Germany has a long and sophisticated tradition of dubbing American content, and partly because the German translation team made a series of specific choices that affected how the humor landed. The German Homer, voiced by an actor who brought a specific kind of gruff warmth to the character, became a beloved figure in Germany in ways that were genuinely comparable to the reception of the American original. German audiences developed strong feelings about the specific choices the dubbing team made, and strong preferences for specific eras of the German voice cast. This created its own controversies within German fandom when the original voice actor for Homer retired and was replaced. The transition was handled with significant media coverage, as if a major cultural transition were underway, which in a sense it was. The voice of Homer Simpson in Germany was a cultural fixture, and the generation that had grown up with that specific voice had a relationship with it that was comparable to the relationship American audiences had with Dan Castellaneta. The French dubbing created its own distinct flavor. The French language has specific comedic registers that differ from American English, and the translation team made choices about which register to use for each character that produced a somewhat different tonal distribution than the original. Bart in French became a somewhat more purely anarchic figure, while Homer's specific brand of well-meaning incompetence translated with slightly different emotional inflections. The French Simpsons was, by many accounts, excellent, and French audiences developed their own deep affection for it that was in some respects independent of the American version. Spain has two different Simpsons, the Castilian Spanish dubbing for mainland Spain and the Latin American Spanish dubbing for the enormous market of Spanish-speaking countries in the Americas. These two versions made different choices, and Spanish speakers from different regions who encounter the wrong version sometimes find the character voices subtly wrong in ways that are hard to articulate but immediately felt. The Latin American Spanish dubbing was produced primarily in Mexico, and the Mexican voice cast became famous in their own right throughout the region, recognized by voice and associated with the characters in ways that precisely paralleled the relationships that existed between the American voices and their characters. When one of the Mexican voice actors who dubbed a major character retired or changed, it was covered as news across multiple countries. The personal grief that fans expressed was real and proportionate to the depth of the attachment they had formed with these specific performances. Japan received The Simpsons with a different kind of attention than most other countries. Japan has its own rich tradition of adult animation, and the context in which The Simpsons arrived was one where the form itself was not unusual, even if the specific content was distinctly American. Japanese audiences were sophisticated about animation in ways that European audiences were not necessarily, and the show found a specific audience in Japan that appreciated it on terms that went beyond its novelty as American content. The Japanese dubbing made choices about localization that reflected the specific cultural distance between the show's reference points and Japanese cultural knowledge. Jokes that depended on familiarity with American political figures, American regional culture, or specific aspects of American history required the most adjustment. Some were simply translated as closely as possible and trusted to the audience's familiarity with American culture. Others were localized with Japanese reference points substituted, and some were essentially left as exotic Americana, with the foreignness itself becoming part of the joke. The Australian reception of The Simpsons is interesting because Australia, as an English-speaking country with a specific cultural relationship to both American culture and British culture, was able to receive the show in its original language while also having its own set of cultural reference points that shaped how specific jokes landed. The show's episode set in Australia, Bart vs. Australia, was watched in Australia with a complex mixture of amusement and mild irritation at the specific stereotypes it employed. Australians found the episode funny, but also somewhat familiar as an example of how Americans tended to see their country, which is to say they found it accurate enough to be recognizable and exaggerated enough to be clearly satirical. The episode is a useful case study in how The Simpsons navigated international subjects. It depicted Australia with a specific set of exaggerated characteristics, including the Prime Minister being casually dismissive of the American government's demands, the culture being aggressively casual about things that Americans found alarming, and the landscape being comically hostile. These exaggerations were recognizable to Australians as plays on real aspects of their culture, and the episode was read by most Australian viewers as affectionate rather than contemptuous, partly because the Americans in the episode were themselves depicted as insufferable in specific and accurate ways. The United Kingdom's relationship with The Simpsons is its own complex chapter. British television had its own tradition of sharp satirical comedy, and British audiences brought sophisticated expectations to American comedy that they felt was reaching for comparable standards. The Simpsons found a devoted British audience that often included people who were already fans of the domestic satirical tradition, who recognized in the show a sensibility that was compatible with what they valued in British comedy, even though the specific cultural material was entirely American. The show's treatment of British culture in the episodes set in the UK, or featuring British characters, was generally affectionate in ways that British audiences appreciated. The aristocratic characters who appeared across various episodes were depicted with a mixture of class satire and genuine appreciation for the specific absurdities of British class culture, in ways that suggested the writers had thought seriously about what they were depicting, rather than simply reaching for obvious stereotypes. South Korea has a specific relationship with The Simpsons that goes beyond audience reception. Several of the animation studios responsible for producing the show's actual animation have been Korean, and Korean animators have been working on the show since its early seasons. The relationship between the American creative team and the Korean animation studios produced its own set of stories and controversies over the years, including the Some Enchanted Evening production crisis we discussed earlier, and it raised broader questions about the global labor arrangements that produce American entertainment. The show made a self-referential joke about its Korean animation connection in the episode Bart the Murderer, in which a brief sequence depicted Korean animators working on The Simpsons. The joke was both an acknowledgement of the production reality and a piece of self-commentary about the specific way that global labor arrangements were implicated in the show's production. The Korean animators who were watching this episode in their own country were watching a show that was commenting on their role in making the show, which is a genuinely strange loop. China's relationship with The Simpsons evolved significantly over the show's run. In the early years, China was not a major market for the show, and the specific content controversies that would emerge from the Goo Goo Gai Pan episode were not yet on the horizon. As China's entertainment market grew in significance, the show's relationship with Chinese censors and Chinese audience expectations became more complicated. The show's willingness to make references to Tiananmen Square and to depict Chinese government with satirical skepticism became increasingly fraught as the commercial stakes in the Chinese market increased. The tension between the show's satirical identity and the requirements of commercial access to the Chinese market was never fully resolved. And the Goo Goo Gai Pan episode's ban was a clear statement of the limits of that resolution. The Simpsons, unlike some American entertainment properties, was not willing to modify its content to meet Chinese censorship standards. And the result was the exclusion of specific content from the Chinese market. Whether this was a principled stand or simply a calculation that the modification would cost more than the market access was worth is not entirely clear from the public record. The International Simpsons represent something genuinely interesting about how culture travels. A show that was built around specifically American anxieties, American institutions, and American cultural reference points became beloved in dozens of countries by audiences who related to it through their own cultural frameworks rather than the one it was built for. The family at the center of the show, the specific dynamic between Homer and Marge, between Bart and Lisa, between the family and the community that both supports and frustrates them, turned out to be resonant across cultural differences in ways that the show's creators may not have fully anticipated. The universal availability of the show through streaming has created a new chapter in its international life, allowing viewers in countries where the show was never dubbed or broadcast widely to discover it in the original language or through subtitles. The global conversation about The Simpsons that now exists on social media, crossing language barriers through subtitled clips and translated commentary, represents a kind of international cultural community that the show helped create. Springfield, the town that cannot be located on any American map, has turned out to be a place that people from around the world feel they recognize. The specific geography may be impossible to identify, but the emotional geography, the anxieties and the humor, and the complicated love between people who are stuck with each other turns out to be somewhere everyone has been. Section 16. Bart versus the World. How one character became a generational symbol. In the fall of 1990, something unusual happened in American popular culture. A fictional 10-year-old boy became the most discussed and debated cultural figure in the country. Bart Simpson's face was on more merchandise than any character in recent memory. His catchphrases were being repeated by children across the country. Politicians were denouncing him, school districts were banning his image, and parents were divided, roughly along generational lines, about whether he represented everything that was wrong with American youth or everything that was honest about it. The Bart phenomenon, as it was sometimes called at the time, was the first major controversy the show generated and the one that established its relationship with American culture most clearly. Bart was not just a character in a television show. Bart was a symbol, and different people read that symbol in entirely different ways. To parents who had grown up with the idea that children's entertainment should model good behavior and respectful attitudes toward authority, Bart was a nightmare. He talked back to teachers. He cheated on tests. He pranked adults without remorse. He expressed his opinions loudly and without the kind of self-editing that adults expected from children in public. He was, in the framework of traditional authority, a bad kid. And there he was, on millions of t-shirts in living rooms every Sunday night, being watched by impressionable children who were presumably learning from his example. To children and to adults who retained enough memory of childhood to understand what it actually felt like, Bart was something different. He was honest. He was the articulation of feelings and impulses that children actually had but were expected to suppress. The frustration with authority figures who were wrong but couldn't be contradicted. The boredom of school that was poorly designed for the specific kind of intelligence he had. The specific kind of mischief that was not cruelty but was absolutely not obedience. Bart said things that children thought but weren't allowed to say, which is the exact definition of comedy that resonates. The unauthorized Bart Simpson t-shirts that proliferated in 1990 and 1991 expanded his symbolic range significantly beyond what the show itself was doing. There were shirts depicting Bart as black, as a gang member, as a rebellious student defying specific authority figures. These shirts were not made by Fox or endorsed by the show's creators. They were made by small entrepreneurs who recognized Bart's symbolic potential and applied it to specific situations the show itself was not addressing. The Black Bart shirts in particular became cultural artifacts, discussed in academic papers about race and representation and popular culture. Bart as a black character made a specific statement about the relationship between his particular brand of defiant irreverence and the black cultural tradition of resistance to authority, and the fact that this statement was being made through unauthorized merchandise rather than through the licensed product said something about who was and was not being seen in the official version of American popular culture in 1990. Fox pursued legal action against the manufacturers of unauthorized merchandise, including the Black Bart shirts, and the enforcement was largely successful in commercial terms. The shirts became harder to find, but the cultural conversation they had generated did not disappear with the merchandise. The question of who Bart Simpson belonged to, of what his defiance meant, and for whom continued to resonate. The school board battles over Bart merchandise are worth examining in some detail because they illustrated how specifically the Bart phenomenon activated existing anxieties about education, authority, and American youth. Schools that banned Bart Simpson t-shirts were not primarily concerned with any specific image or message on the shirts. They were concerned with what Bart represented, the idea that authority could be questioned, that defiance could be funny rather than shameful, that a child who did not defer to institutional expectations was not simply bad but was interesting. This was threatening in a specific way to educational institutions that depended on a degree of student compliance to function. The teacher who had to discipline a student wearing a Bart Simpson shirt was, in a sense, reenacting the dynamic between Bart and his teachers, and the student wearing the shirt was aware of this. The shirt was not just clothing. It was a statement about the student's relationship to the institution they were required to attend. The irony of all this institutional anxiety about Bart's influence is that the character himself, when examined carefully, is considerably more sympathetic than the critics gave him credit for. Bart is not a villain. He is not cruel. His mischief is consistently directed at institutions and authority figures rather than at vulnerable individuals. When Bart's pranks go too far and genuinely hurt people he cares about, the show takes the consequences seriously. Bart is capable of genuine remorse and genuine loyalty. The show gives him real friendships and real family bonds and real moments of emotional vulnerability that complicate the simple portrait of defiant bad boy that his critics preferred to see. The relationship between Bart and Homer was itself one of the show's most honest and emotionally complex threads. Homer's perpetual strangling of Bart, played as a running gag, was also an honest portrait of a specific kind of father-son frustration. The gap between the child's actual personality and the parent's desire to have a different kind of child. Homer wanted Bart to be simpler, more obedient, more legible to him. Bart wanted Homer to understand him. Neither fully got what they wanted, and the show never pretended otherwise. By the mid-1990s, the Bart phenomenon had somewhat subsided, partly because the cultural novelty had worn off, and partly because Lisa Simpson had emerged as a character of comparable cultural significance who attracted a different and, in some respects, more intellectually engaged conversation. The initial controversy around Bart settled into something more like acceptance, and the qualities that had seemed threatening in 1990 were by 1995 simply part of the show's established character. But Bart's cultural legacy remained. The generation that grew up with him, that wore the shirts and said the catchphrases and identified with his specific brand of articulate defiance, carried something from that experience into adulthood. The idea that authority is not automatically worthy of respect, that institutions can be questioned, that being bad at conventional success does not make you bad as a person. These ideas, which Bart embodied in cartoon form, were ideas that a generation absorbed and applied. Whether Bart Simpson influenced a generation or simply reflected anxieties and attitudes that were already present is the kind of question that has no clean answer. Cultural influence does not work in a single direction. But the argument that Bart was purely reflective, that he merely showed the audience something it already believed, seems too simple. The specific form in which he showed it, the specific humor with which defiance was presented as neither tragic nor heroic but simply funny and human, did something to the conversation about what American childhood could look like. The specific catchphrases associated with Bart, phrases like "don't have a cow" and "eat my shorts" and "cowabunga," entered the cultural vocabulary with the speed that suggested they were filling a specific gap. There were things that American children felt and did not have the exact right words for, and Bart provided words that were exactly right in their specific quality of casual, cheerful irreverence. These phrases did not survive primarily because Bart said them, but because they said something true in a new way. By the time the Bart phenomenon had become cultural history, something interesting had happened. The anxious parents of 1990, the ones who worried about their children wearing Bart shirts to school, had themselves become objects of mild comedy. The moral panic about Bart's influence on children looked, from the perspective of 20 years later, like an example of the specific kind of institutional anxiety that Bart himself was making fun of. The people who were most worried about Bart's cultural influence had proved, by their worry, that they had not understood what the show was doing. The character endured because the feeling he represented endured. Children continue to be in institutions that do not fully accommodate the specific kind of intelligence and energy they have. Adults continue to have authority over those children in ways that are sometimes justified and sometimes arbitrary. The specific dynamic that made Bart funny in 1990 is still a live dynamic, and the character continues to find new audiences precisely because the situation he represents has not changed. Bart Simpson is still 10 years old. He has been 10 years old for 36 years, and every new generation of 10-year-olds who encounter him finds something in him that they recognize, something that the adults around them either cannot or will not say. That is a legacy that no amount of school board action and presidential criticism could touch. The show was always right about Bart, and the people who were worried about him were always wrong, not because defiance is always justified, but because the specific thing Bart was defying, the expectation that children would be quiet and compliant and grateful for whatever authority decided to give them, deserved to be defied. It still does. Section 17. The Springfield Ecosystem, Minor Characters, Background Chaos, and the World-Building Controversies. One of the most quietly radical things about The Simpsons is not any of the specific controversies it generated or any of the specific creative risks it took, but rather the extraordinary decision it made early in its run to build a town that was genuinely populated. Springfield is not a background. Springfield is a place that exists in its own right, with dozens of recurring characters who have their own histories, their own relationships, their own traumas and loyalties and weird specific obsessions, and who appear and reappear across hundreds of episodes in ways that accumulate into something that feels like a living community rather than a set of props. This decision had consequences. The more characters you give real personalities to, the more opportunities you create for those personalities to generate their own controversies. Springfield's population is large enough and specific enough that almost any social phenomenon, any profession, any community type has a representative in Springfield who can become a focal point for criticism, praise, or debate. The characters of Springfield who generated the most internal debate within the show's production were not always the ones who generated the most public controversy. The production team had its own ongoing arguments about how various characters should be handled, what kinds of stories were appropriate for them, how to prevent popular secondary characters from becoming too prominent or too distorted. Sideshow Bob is one of the show's most beloved recurring characters, and also one of the clearest illustrations of what happens when a character becomes popular enough to generate demand for more appearances than the story logic of the show can easily accommodate. Bob was introduced as a supporting character in an early episode, voiced by Kelsey Grammer in a performance that was so distinctively excellent that the audience immediately wanted more of him. He was developed into a recurring antagonist across multiple episodes, and his interactions with Bart became one of the show's most dependable sources of comedy and genuine tension. But the challenge with Sideshow Bob is that he is fundamentally a villain whose entire characterization is built around his inability to kill Bart Simpson. Every time he appears, the implicit question is why he has not yet succeeded. The answer to that question has become increasingly strained across the many episodes in which Bob has appeared, and the show has had to find more and more elaborate ways to either delay his violence or explain his failure. At a certain point, the character's continued existence in the show became dependent on the audience's willingness to accept an increasingly artificial justification for why Bart was still alive. The Kelsey Grammer connection created its own layer of complexity. Grammer's real-world controversies, which included various personal and legal difficulties over the years, occasionally produced discussions within the show's production about whether and how to continue his association with the character. The show made the decision, in each case, to continue the association, treating the character and the actor as separable in ways that do not always fully satisfy critics of the practice. Lionel Hutz and Troy McClure, two of the show's most beloved recurring characters, disappeared from the show after Phil Hartman, who voiced both characters, was murdered by his wife in 1998. The decision to retire the characters rather than recast them was made quickly and without public deliberation, and it reflected the specific nature of the loss. These were not just roles, they were performances that Hartman had given a specific quality that was inseparable from his voice and his sensibility. Recasting them would have been both a creative diminishment and, in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, a kind of indignity to his memory. The retirement of Hudson McClure removed two characters who had been among the show's most reliably funny recurring presences. Their absence was noticed and mourned by viewers, and the episodes they had appeared in became repositories of specific affection for Hartman's contribution to the show. The retrospective appreciation for his work intensified after his death, as is often the case, and his Simpsons performances became an important part of his legacy as a comedian. The question of whether to retire characters after the deaths of their voice actors came up again in later years as the show's cast aged and losses became more frequent. The policy of not recasting has generally held, with characters simply appearing less frequently or being written around when their original voice actor was no longer available. This policy has sometimes strained the show's storytelling, requiring creative solutions to explain why certain characters have become less present or why certain lines are being delivered differently than they once were. The recurring background characters of Springfield, the ones who appear regularly enough to be recognizable but who have fewer lines than the main cast, became the subject of their own community of appreciation. Hans Moleman, Disco Stew, Gil, the sea captain, Squeaky Voice Teen, Otto the bus driver. These are characters who have become beloved through accumulated presence rather than through star turns, and their specific qualities have been noticed and celebrated by audiences who pay close enough attention to recognize them across hundreds of episodes. The writer's relationship with these background characters was a mixture of affection and occasional exasperation. The more recognizable a background character became, the more the audience noticed when they were used inconsistently, when their established personality was ignored for the convenience of a joke, or when they appeared in contexts that contradicted what had previously been established about them. The show was generating its own continuity burdens through the quality of its world building, and managing those burdens became a real challenge as the seasons accumulated. The Springfield ecology of characters also created a specific kind of fan culture that was different from the fan culture that existed around other shows. The Simpsons fans who dedicated themselves to tracking the background characters, to cataloging their appearances, to constructing theories about their relationships and histories, were engaging with the show at a level of detail that the show's production team had not necessarily intended and could not always support. The show had created a world rich enough to sustain this kind of close attention, and the attention itself became a kind of pressure on the show to be consistent in ways that episodic television is not always capable of being. Principal Skinner, or rather Armin Tamzarian, as we have discussed at length, represents the most dramatic case of what happened when the show disrupted the established history of one of its own beloved characters. The fan response to the revelation of Skinner's true identity was so uniformly negative that the episode became a cautionary tale about the limits of what long-running shows could do with characters who had accumulated years of audience investment. The audience had developed a relationship with a version of Skinner that was based on his established history, and the revelation that the history was false felt like a betrayal of that relationship. The show has generally learned from this experience, though it took some time to do so. Later season episodes have generally been more careful about disrupting the established histories of beloved characters in ways that undermine the audience's relationship with them. The lesson was not that the show could not take risks with its characters, but that certain kinds of risks, specifically risks that retroactively invalidated the audience's existing emotional investment, were likely to generate more backlash than they were worth. The question of Springfield's size has been a recurring source of internal discussion and occasional fan complaint. The show depicts Springfield as both a small town with a small-town atmosphere and a city with urban institutions, the kind of place that somehow has a harbor and a mountain and a tire fire that has been burning for 30 years, and an opera house and a nuclear power plant, all within what seems like a modest geographic area. The specific size of Springfield has never been established clearly, and the show has been deliberately inconsistent about it, allowing Springfield to be whatever size the current episode requires. This inconsistency has been criticized as a failure of world-building discipline, but it can also be read as a deliberate stylistic choice that reflects the show's fundamental nature. Springfield is not meant to be a realistic city. It is meant to be the idealized American town, the town that contains everything and has whatever the story requires it to have. Its impossible geography is part of its identity, just as the impossible physics of its characters and the impossible continuity of its history are part of its identity. The world of Springfield, with all its contradictions and inconsistencies and remarkable density of specific, beloved characters, is itself one of the show's greatest creative achievements. The decision to build a genuine community rather than a generic backdrop has paid dividends across 36 seasons in ways that could not have been fully anticipated when the decision was made. Every character who was given a specific personality, every minor recurring figure who was developed beyond their function in a single episode, was an investment that paid returns in the form of decades of accumulated audience attachment. The controversies that emerged from this world building were the controversies of a creative project that had taken itself seriously enough to build something real. When the audience protested the disruption of Skinner's history, they were protesting on behalf of something they genuinely cared about. When they mourned the retirement of Hutz and McClure, they were mourning real creative losses. When they celebrated the return of Sideshow Bob, they were celebrating a character who had genuinely earned their affection over many years and many episodes. A show that did not build something real would not generate this kind of response. The controversies, in their own way, are evidence of the world's reality. People argue about real places. They grieve real losses. They celebrate real returns. Springfield, for all its impossibility, has become real enough in the emotional lives of its audience to sustain all of these reactions. That is the most remarkable thing about it. Section 18. The Simpsons in the Age of Streaming. Revivals, reruns, and what comes next. The arrival of streaming changed the relationship between audiences and The Simpsons in ways that are still being understood. Before streaming, the show's history was stratified by Aurora in ways that were partly enforced by the mechanics of television distribution. People who grew up watching the show in first run had seen specific seasons in their specific moments. People who discovered the show through syndication had encountered it in a context of reshuffled, somewhat randomized episode selection. The show's history was accessible but not conveniently so, requiring active effort to seek out specific seasons or specific episodes. Streaming dissolved these barriers. The entire archive of the show became available simultaneously, at a level of quality and convenience that made it possible to watch any episode from any season in any order at any time. This created a new kind of Simpsons fandom, built around easy archive access, that was different from the fandom that had existed before. The new viewers could watch the classic seasons immediately after watching the contemporary seasons, or watch both without clear awareness of the temporal distance between them. This had specific consequences for how the show's quality decline was discussed. Before streaming, the contrast between the classic and contemporary seasons was something you had to work to experience. You had to find old episodes, seek them out, compare them deliberately. Streaming made the comparison effortless, and the contrast was immediately apparent to anyone who watched a run of classic episodes followed by a run of contemporary ones. The Zombie Simpsons debate, which had been conducted largely by dedicated fans who had done the work of comparison, became accessible to anyone with a Disney Plus subscription who was curious enough to look. The streaming era also changed the economics of the show in ways that affected its production. The value of a streaming catalog is different from the value of a broadcast rating. A show that is watched by millions of subscribers who stream its back catalog, but do not watch its new episodes, has value to a streaming platform in ways that are different from its value to a broadcast network that needs current viewers to sell to advertisers. The Simpsons on Disney Plus is valuable partly because of its vast archive, and the archive's value is independent of whether the current seasons are excellent. This creates an interesting situation for the show's creative team. They are producing new episodes in a context where the primary commercial value of the franchise comes from its history rather than its present. The new episodes are not irrelevant to that value, but they are no longer the primary vehicle for it. The show continues partly for commercial reasons that have shifted from the original commercial reasons that sustained it, and the shift changes the relationship between creative ambition and commercial necessity. The Disney acquisition of Fox, and therefore of The Simpsons, in 2019 created a new institutional context for the show that was itself a remarkable piece of cultural irony. The show had spent decades making jokes at Disney's expense, sometimes gently and sometimes with pointed satirical intent. Now the show was part of the Disney empire, its jokes about Disney now coming from inside the house. The situation was the kind of thing that the show itself would have found funny, and it did, making several self-aware jokes about the acquisition in episodes that followed. The streaming platform also created new opportunities for the show's content to reach audiences who had not previously had access to it. Countries where the show had been distributed selectively, or where broadcast rights had not been widely held, could now access the full archive through Disney Plus in those markets. The global Simpsons conversation expanded, with new voices entering from countries where the show was genuinely new. The question of what the show's future looks like in the streaming era is genuinely open. The show has announced new seasons and arrangements with Fox and Disney that ensure its continuation for the immediate future, but the specific terms under which it will exist, how many episodes per season, what the production standards will be, who will be involved creatively, are all subject to negotiation and evolution in ways that they were not when the show was simply the most successful thing on Fox and the network's most important ongoing priority. The Treehouse of Horror specials have adapted particularly well to the streaming context, partly because their anthology format makes them easier to consume in non-linear ways, and partly because their cultural event quality. They are among the most discussed annual pieces of television content in social media terms, gives them a specific value that the standard episodes sometimes lack. The specials have become appointment television in a streaming world where appointment television has otherwise largely dissolved, and their annual arrival is treated by a significant community of viewers as a genuine cultural moment. The Disney Plus aspect ratio controversy, which required the platform to eventually offer the original 4:3 format alongside the cropped widescreen version, illustrated something important about the streaming era's relationship to television history. The assumption that older content could simply be reformatted to match contemporary screen standards, without regard for the creative choices embedded in the original format, was challenged effectively by a fan community that understood both the technical issue and what it meant for the show's actual content. The lesson, if there is one, is that the archive of a show like The Simpsons is not just a collection of content to be made available. It is a creative and cultural artifact whose specific characteristics are worth preserving. The people who made the early episodes understood the 4:3 frame as a creative tool and used it specifically. Modifying the frame changes the work. The streaming era, with its enormous archives of content being processed and reformatted at scale, has repeatedly created opportunities for exactly this kind of modification, and the Simpsons aspect ratio controversy was one of the clearest examples of fans successfully advocating for the preservation of the original creative intent. What comes next for The Simpsons is a question that the show itself seems content not to answer definitively. The show's relationship to its own future has always been complicated by its fundamental premise, which is that the future is foreclosed by the necessity of return to the present. The show cannot really end because ending would require the characters to move forward, and moving forward would mean letting them go. And letting them go is the thing the show has refused to do for 36 years. But something will change. The voice cast will eventually be unable to continue. The writers who have sustained the show's institutional knowledge will eventually move on. The commercial context that has justified the show's continuation will eventually shift in ways that make continuation less clearly the right choice. The show will end, and the ending will be a genuine cultural event, the kind of thing that generates its own final wave of controversy and reflection, and the specific kind of grief that only comes from losing something that has been part of your life for an extraordinary length of time. Until that happens, the show continues. New episodes arrive. The couch gag plays. Homer looks up at the lights. The family finds its way to the same seat they have been occupying since 1989, and the audience finds its way back to them because something in the watching still feels like coming home. Whether that feeling is nostalgia or genuine appreciation or simple habit is a question each viewer answers for themselves. But the watching continues, and the feeling continues, and Springfield persists in the specific way that places that exist in imagination persist. Completely, stubbornly, permanently. Section 19. The Simpsons and Race, a conversation that lasted decades. The Simpsons has always been a show made primarily by white creators depicting a white family in an American town where white characters occupy most of the prominent narrative positions. This is not unusual for American television, particularly American television of the late 1980s and early 1990s when the show began. But The Simpsons, because of its longevity and its cultural significance, has had to engage with questions about race and representation for longer and in more detail than most shows of comparable vintage. The engagement began with the casting decisions of the early seasons, which reflected standard industry practice but which acquired a different significance as the culture's understanding of that practice evolved. The show used white actors to voice characters of color across its entire early run, a practice that was unremarkable when the show started, and that became increasingly contested as the decades passed. The representation question extended beyond casting. The specific ways in which characters of various racial backgrounds were depicted, the stories that were and were not told about them, the degree to which they were given interior lives as complex as the white characters at the show's center. These were questions that the show's progressive audience increasingly brought to it, and that the show did not always answer in ways that satisfied them. Carl Carlson, one of Homer's closest friends at the nuclear plant, was voiced by a white actor for many seasons before the role was recast with a black actor. The decision to eventually recast the role reflected the broader reckoning in animation about the practice of white actors voicing characters of color. But it also raised the question of what, if anything, had been lost or distorted by the original casting. Had the show told Carl's story differently because the voice came from a white actor? Had the character been written in ways that avoided the specifics of black experience, because the people writing and performing the character did not have that experience to draw on? These questions are difficult to answer definitively, but they are worth asking, and the show's history with Carl illustrates the broader challenge of taking a diverse ensemble seriously over a 36-year run that began in a different cultural moment. The show's Springfield has always included Black and Latino and Asian characters, and the show has at various points tried to tell stories that engaged with the specific experiences of these communities. Some of these attempts were better received than others. The episodes that worked best were generally the ones where the writers drew on specific knowledge or specific consultation, rather than on generic representations, where the comedy came from particulars rather than from broad strokes. The Latino representation question became particularly acute in later seasons, as the show's writers became more aware of the critical scrutiny being applied to their choices. Episodes set in Latin America or featuring Latino characters prominently were examined more carefully by critics and audiences who were looking for the specific kind of stereotyping that had characterized earlier representations. The show's relationship with the Asian American community intersected with its own production history in specific ways. The Korean animation studios that produced much of the show's actual animation work were present in the show's universe, acknowledged in the self-referential joke we discussed earlier. But Korean-American characters within Springfield were relatively scarce compared to the scale of the Korean production contribution to the show. This gap was occasionally noted by critics who observed the discrepancy between the Korean labor that made the show and the Korean characters who appeared in it. The African-American community's relationship with the show is complex in ways that the Apu conversation did not always capture. The show has a significant black fan base that has engaged with it deeply and for a long time, finding in its satire of American institutions something that resonated with specifically African-American perspectives on those institutions. The show's critique of the police, of the legal system, of the media, of political corruption, of corporate exploitation of workers, landed differently for viewers who experienced these institutions from the underside than for viewers who experienced them from positions of relative privilege. This dual reception, the show being read in different ways by different communities who were all watching the same content, is one of the interesting features of the show's cultural history. The Simpsons was not a show about race in the explicit sense, but it was a show about power, about institutions, about the specific ways that ordinary life is shaped by forces that most individuals cannot meaningfully resist. These are themes that resonate differently across different subject positions, and the show's longevity has allowed multiple generations with multiple different relationships to American institutions to engage with it and find in it something that felt relevant to their specific situation. The show's failure to have this conversation explicitly, to acknowledge the ways in which race specifically shapes the experience of American institutions, is itself a kind of choice. The decision to depict a colorblind Springfield, where the Simpson family's experience is presented as generically American rather than specifically white American, is a form of representation, not an absence of it. What it represents is a particular kind of American fantasy about the universality of the middle-class experience. And the show's progressive critics have argued that this fantasy is itself a racial position, one that normalizes whiteness as the default experience of American life. These are arguments the show has never fully engaged with and never quite answered. And the silence on this specific question stands in interesting contrast to the show's willingness to engage with so many other forms of cultural criticism. The show has been more willing to examine its own choices around representation of South Asian identity through the Apu conversation than to examine its choices around the central racial framework within which the show operates. Whether this reflects the specific nature of the Apu controversy, forcing the issue in a way that the broader racial framing question has not, or whether it reflects something more fundamental about the limits of the show's self-examination, is a question that remains genuinely open. The show continues to navigate these questions in its current seasons, with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of engagement with the specific critical discourse that surrounds them. The cultural context in which it is operating has changed significantly from the context in which it began, and the show's audience has developed expectations around representation and accountability that were not part of the original cultural contract between the show and its viewers. Navigating those new expectations while maintaining a creative identity that was formed in a different era is one of the genuine challenges the show faces in its later seasons. What the show has demonstrated, across its history with these questions, is that it is capable of genuine self-reflection when that self-reflection is forced to the surface by external pressure. The Apu reckoning happened because external pressure made ignoring it impossible. The voice casting changes happened because external pressure made the status quo untenable. The show is responsive to pressure in ways that suggest the capacity for genuine change, even if the pace and completeness of that change has not always satisfied its critics. The conversation about race and The Simpsons is not finished. It will continue as long as the show continues, and it will likely continue after the show ends, as part of the broader historical accounting of what the show was, and what it did, and what it left undone. That accounting will be more complicated than either the show's most devoted defenders or its sharpest critics might prefer, because the show itself is more complicated than either of those positions can fully accommodate. Section 20. Endings, Returns, and the Question of Goodbye. The Simpsons has ended and begun again many times in the imagination of its audience. It has ended in the minds of viewers who decided, at some specific point in its run, that the show they loved had stopped being what it was. It has begun again when a particularly good episode appeared and reminded those viewers of why they had loved it. It has ended in the planning documents of Fox executives trying to contain the show's KIAM. It has begun again in the negotiations that kept those executives from going through with their threats. The show has never actually ended, but the idea of its ending has been a presence throughout its entire run, shaping how the show was made and how it was received, and how its future was contemplated by the people involved in creating it. The final episode question, when it eventually has to be answered, will be one of the most discussed creative decisions in television history. A show that has run for nearly 4 decades and has meant so much to so many people deserves an ending that acknowledges what it was. The question of what that ending might look like has been discussed and speculated about for years, with fans and critics proposing various possibilities. Some have argued that the show should end where it started, with a return to the emotional and tonal simplicity of the early seasons. A final episode that recaptures the specific quality of the show at its best and offers it as a farewell gift to the audience that has waited through all the subsequent seasons. This ending would be satisfying in a nostalgic sense, but might feel dishonest about the show's actual history. as though the decades of variable quality were being quietly wished away. Others have argued that the ending should be definitive in a narrative sense, should move the characters forward in time and show what happens to them, who they become, how the story resolves. This ending would give the audience the satisfaction of seeing the characters in futures they have never been allowed to inhabit, but would require the show to finally commit to a direction for those characters that the floating timeline has allowed it to avoid for 3 decades. Still others have argued that the ending should be a meta-commentary, should acknowledge explicitly that the show has been going on too long, and that the ending is both overdue and genuinely sad, should hold both the gratitude for what it was and the recognition of what it became without resolving the tension between them. This ending would be honest, but honesty is not always the primary thing an ending needs to provide. The show's actual ending, when it comes, will probably be determined at least partly by commercial and contractual factors, rather than purely by creative vision. The ending of a franchise is an economic event as much as a creative one, and the terms under which the show concludes will reflect the negotiations between all the parties who have interests in it. The audience's desire for a satisfying ending is one input into those negotiations, but not necessarily the dominant one. What the audience deserves, after 36 years and 800 episodes, is at minimum an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that the show was something real and that its ending matters, that the specific world it built and the specific characters it populated that world with deserve a goodbye that takes them seriously. Whether the show is capable of delivering that acknowledgement, given all the institutional complexities and commercial constraints that will shape its ending, is an open question. But the desire for it is itself worth noting. The audience's desire for a meaningful ending is a measure of how much they have invested. You do not care about how something ends if it never mattered to you. The very existence of the conversation about what a proper Simpsons ending would look like is evidence that the show has mattered, deeply and persistently, to an enormous number of people. The show will end, the characters will stop, Springfield will be silent, and the people who loved it will carry something from it into whatever comes next. Some specific quality that the show gave them, some way of seeing the world or finding it funny or recognizing the gap between what things are and what they are supposed to be. That is the enduring gift of great comedy. Not the specific jokes, which fade, but the perspective behind the jokes, which stays. For 36 years, The Simpsons told the truth about American life in the specific language of absurdist comedy. It did it imperfectly, with the limitations of its time and its industry and its specific human creators. But it did it honestly and persistently, and with more care and intelligence than most things managed for even a fraction of that time. When it ends, it will have earned the ending. And the people watching that final episode will know, as they have always known, that they are watching something that will not be fully replaced. Something whose specific quality and specific intelligence and specific willingness to tell the truth through jokes belongs to a specific moment and a specific group of people who found each other in a writer's room and built something that lasted. That is the story of The Simpsons. The scandals are part of it, and the brilliance is part of it, and the decline is part of it, and the loyalty of the audience is part of it. All of it together is the story of what happens when a culture tries to tell the truth about itself in a way that is also funny, and discovers that telling the truth through comedy is both the hardest possible thing and the most necessary. Springfield endures. The family endures. And somewhere in that endurance is the answer to every question this video has tried to ask. Not the answer to who shot Mr. Burns, or whether Homer is in a coma, or where Springfield is on the map. The answer to the simpler and more important question, why do we care? Because it's true. Because it's funny. And because after all these years, it's ours. That is everything. Thank you for spending this time with Springfield's full history of scandals, controversies, and brilliant chaos. Subscribe if you want more, and sleep well. Section 21. The Writer's Room That Changed Television. Inside the culture that made Springfield possible before The Simpsons, the dominant model of television comedy was one in which a small number of writers produced scripts in relative isolation, often working from the creative vision of a single showrunner, whose taste defined the show's identity. The Simpsons, partly through intention and partly through the specific demands of producing 22 episodes of highly literary comedy per season, developed a different model. It became a writer's room in the most intensive sense of that term, a space where an unusually large number of unusually educated writers spent enormous amounts of time together, competing and collaborating and building something that no individual among them could have produced alone. The specific culture of that room has been described in interviews and memoirs and occasional documentary appearances by people who were part of it. What emerges from these accounts is a portrait of an environment that was simultaneously brilliant and exhausting, where the standard for a joke was genuinely high and where jokes were improved by collective pressure in ways that were sometimes brutal but consistently productive. The show's early writers were remarkable for their educational backgrounds. The proportion of Harvard graduates in The Simpsons writers' room was, and has remained, extraordinary by the standards of any creative workplace. The Harvard Lampoon, the university's humor magazine, served as a pipeline to the show that produced some of its most celebrated early contributors. The cultural significance of this pipeline is worth understanding. The Harvard Lampoon tradition is a specific kind of comedy, highly literate, deeply referential, comfortable with absurdism and wordplay, invested in the idea that comedy could be smart without ceasing to be funny. This tradition shaped the show's comedy in specific ways. The Simpsons jokes, particularly in the classic seasons, tend to reward close attention. They are constructed with a precision that suggests writers who thought carefully about the specific words and their specific implications. The show's best jokes are not just funny. They are funny in ways that become funnier the more you know about what they are referencing and why the specific words used are the right words. The density of the comedy, the way jokes were layered across multiple registers simultaneously, visual and verbal and structural, was a product of the specific competitive culture of the room. A joke that worked on only one level was a joke that could be improved. A scene that was just funny was a scene that could also be meaningful. The show's best work is almost always operating on several levels at once, and the discipline required to achieve that was enforced by the collective intelligence of a room full of people who could see the levels and who would not accept less. The room's culture also had its more difficult dimensions, which have been discussed with increasing candor as the distance from the experience has grown and as the culture's understanding of workplace dynamics has evolved. The comedy writers' room culture of the 1990s was, in many respects, a culture that would not survive intact into the present. The hours were extreme. The social dynamics were intense in ways that included both genuine camaraderie and competitive pressure that could be psychologically costly. The demographics were heavily male and heavily white in ways that meant certain perspectives were systematically absent from the conversations that shaped the show. The absence of diverse voices in the writers' room has been cited as a contributing factor in the show's most significant representation failures. The Apu question specifically was answered partly by who was in the room when the character was developed and when the decisions about how to develop him were made. A room that included South Asian writers might have made different choices, not because the inclusion of diverse writers is a simple solution to complex creative problems, but because the specific knowledge and perspective that those writers would have brought would have changed what was visible to the people making the decisions. The show's gradual diversification of its writing staff over the decades has been documented but not extensively publicized. The room in 2025 is different from the room in 1995, though how different and in what specific ways is not fully public information. The show's representatives have spoken about efforts to bring in more diverse voices, and some of those efforts are visible in the show's recent seasons in the specific perspectives and references that appear in the writing. Whether those efforts have been sufficient, whether the room now reflects the diversity of the culture the show is trying to describe, is a question that can only be answered from inside. The physical culture of the room itself has changed significantly. The early writers' room was a place where people gathered for long hours and worked through problems collectively in real time, where the specific energy of people competing to make each other laugh was part of the creative process. Remote work arrangements, which became more prevalent in the entertainment industry before 2020 and became dominant during the pandemic and somewhat normalized afterward, changed this culture in ways that are not fully understood even by the people inside them. The specific quality of comedy that comes from writers working together in a room, feeding off each other's energy, building on each other's ideas in real time, may or may not be fully reproducible through remote collaboration tools. The people who experienced both modes have various opinions about this. And the question of whether the contemporary show's writing reflects the change in how the writing is produced is one that critics who care about the show continue to discuss. The alumni network that The Simpsons writers' room produced is one of the most significant collective creative forces in American entertainment. The people who worked in that room learned to write comedy at its specific standard and then went on to other projects carried what they learned with them. The shows that The Simpsons alumni created are everywhere in American comedy, and the sensibility they brought to those shows is shaped, in part, by what they learned about what comedy could be when it was working at its absolute best. This is the final piece of the show's legacy that deserves acknowledgement in any comprehensive accounting of what The Simpsons was. Not the ratings or the revenue or the merchandise or the legal battles or the scandals or the prediction memes. The thing the show produced that will outlast all of those is a generation of writers who learned to be funnier and more honest and more demanding of themselves by working in its specific environment. Those writers are making things now. They will go on making things. And the specific quality of intelligence they bring to those things is, in some meaningful sense, a continuation of what The Simpsons was. Great institutions persist not just in themselves, but in what they create beyond themselves. The Simpsons has persisted in itself for an extraordinary length of time, and that persistence has generated controversies and complications that fill a video this long and could fill several more. But it has also persisted in the people it shaped and the standards it set and the demonstration it offered of what comedy could do when it was serious enough about itself to be genuinely ambitious. That is the real legacy, and it is worth knowing about, and it belongs alongside everything else. The banned episodes, and the pay disputes, and the representation failures, and the prediction phenomenon, and the decline debate, and the couch that never changes, and the town that cannot be found on any map. All of it together is the story of what The Simpsons actually was. Not just a television show, a way of telling the truth about the world that made 36 years of Sunday nights mean something. Springfield is still there, the lights are still on, and the story, even if you never hear another episode of it, is still going. Thank you for being here for all of it. If you made it to the end of this, truly thank you. Subscribe if you want more, drop a comment, and rest well. Springfield will be here when you wake up. Afterward, a note on Springfield's permanence. There is a particular quality to the things we love when we are young that is different from everything else we love in our lives. The things that reach us before we have the language to describe what they are doing to us, before we can explain why they matter or what it means that they matter, those things become part of the furniture of the self in a way that later loves do not. For a generation that grew up in the 1990s, The Simpsons was that kind of thing. It arrived before they fully understood what television comedy was, before they could articulate the specific qualities that made it different from everything else on the screen at the same time. It was just there, reliably, every Sunday night, delivering something that felt true in ways they couldn't explain and funny in ways they could feel but not yet analyze. The scandals and controversies that this video has traced are my bar story, in one sense, the adult story of a show that many people first encountered as children. The arguments about representation and labor and quality and legacy are arguments that require a sophistication about how creative industries work, about the politics of culture, about the history of American entertainment, that a 10-year-old watching Bart write on the chalkboard does not possess. The 10-year-old is not thinking about the Apu controversy or the contract disputes or whether the current season measures up to season 5. The 10-year-old is just watching the show, and the show is doing what it was always best at doing, which is showing a family that is exactly wrong about everything and exactly right about each other. That original experience, the simple experience of a show that made you laugh, while making you feel something real about the people it depicted, is not erased by the adult knowledge of the controversies around it. The two things exist together, the complicated history and the pure original love. And the complicated history does not make the original love wrong. It makes it more honest, more complete, more true to what the show actually was, rather than the simplified version of it that nostalgia prefers. The Simpsons was a show made by human beings, with human limitations working within institutional constraints that shaped what they could and could not do. It was also a show that, at its best, achieved something genuinely extraordinary. A sustained period of creative excellence that changed what television comedy was capable of, and that will be studied and cited and argued about for as long as people care about the history of popular culture. Both of those things are true. All of the things this video has described are true. The brilliance and the failures, the courage and the institutional cowardice, the representation that landed and the representation that caused harm, the prophecies and the panics and the legal battles and the near cancellations. All of it is the real story, not the simplified version in either direction, neither the pure nostalgia that erases the problems, nor the critical demolition that erases the genuine achievement. Springfield was a real place in the way that fictional places can be real, which is to say it was real enough to generate 36 years of genuine feeling in an extraordinary number of people across an extraordinary range of circumstances. The controversies it generated were controversies about real things. The love it inspired was love for something that deserved it. That is the whole truth about The Simpsons, told as honestly as the length of this video allows. The town is still there, the family is still home, and the story, for now, continues.